Hey everyone, I am Mike, and with me as always is Corey, and we are both professional pixel artists. And today we're going to look at especially to those in the Western world in America, a real hidden treasure. This game is called Rastan. Oh, it's got a big name. Hold on, Warrior Blade Rastan Saga III, I think is the full name. Did I get that right, Corey? Do you remember?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
believe
for
so.
sure. Yeah.
With a colon. So.
Yes, of course.
Right.
Everyone's got one of those, but tish. But anyway, so yeah, you can see on the screen here the game we're going to be talking about, and this game has a fairly interesting history that I don't know in full detail, and the series has an interesting story that I also don't know in full detail. So the original Rastan was a simple side-scrolling platformer hack and slash game. A very early 16-bit arcade game, and clearly very influenced by Conan. And it was a very decent game that was quite liked at the time and had a fantastic soundtrack to it. So it did really well. And then, a year or two or whatever down the line, they made a sequel that clearly a very different team did, and it's just shockingly bad. The second one was, and I think they knew when they were going to be distributing and selling the arcade cabinet in America. I think the marketing people or whoever knew that the game was shockingly bad looking, because they decided to market it not in the franchise Rastan, but to change a couple of letters around and literally rename it to Nastar Saga instead of Rastan Saga. So they kind of disassociated it from the much better looking, better sounding, and probably better playing game. I have to say, in all honesty, like the first time I ever tried to take a look at and play Nastar Saga on an emulator, I immediately turned it off and deleted the ROM file.
Yeah. Clearly, whoever decided to rename it already they worked it into the name. They called it Nastar.
Nastar.
They knew no one would accept. I understand. It is amazing though, because the first game, it looks like of its generation, a quaint kind of platformer.
Right.
It's not. Yeah, it's not amazing by today's standards, but
Right.
I can see why people liked it and it became
Yeah.
popular.
It's
It's amazing to see that sort of
right.
downgrade, I guess.
It certainly was not, even for its time, revolutionary or outstanding in any particular way, but it was solid. Right. It looked decent and it sounded great. And and there weren't a lot of sort of Conan style games back then, so it established its sort of niche. It was like one of the action Conan style games, and so it gained a lot of fans, and just they took a real wrong step for the sequel. Right. But then what's interesting is I didn't know until so many years later that there was ever a third game, and that's this game we're looking at here, which for some weird reason was, I think, only released in Japan. Do you remember? Is that correct?
I believe so, yeah. I think we never saw this. That's why it's kind of, a hidden
treasure.
Treasure, yeah. And it's got this wide format, interestingly.
Two screens in the original arcade cabinet, two screens butted side by side, which there are quite a few games that did two or three. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, the X-Men game, like a lot of the Fighters, the Simpsons, and also there was a shmup that did that in the arcade. I can't think of which one. But anyway, it wasn't used anywhere near as often as your standard one screen, but it was becoming pretty big. Taito themselves had used it for a couple of games, I think, by then. One of them was, I think what was it called? Ninja Warriors, I think, where it was like the cybernetic ninjas that blow up when it reveals their Terminator-style ninja robot exoskeleton as they lose their health points. But anyway, get back to...
And this was like 1991.
Yeah.
And I think, we had talked about how Golden Axe, came
Yeah.
out in '89, so they were
Yeah.
clearly trying to one up,
Hmm.
Golden Axe with this, which they did,
Yeah.
I would say, but
Yeah.
it's interesting that it's very reminiscent of that, and because the
Yeah.
other games are just they're platformers, and they decided to just completely almost rebrand the series with this.
Right, yeah,
Seems like.
it's extremely hard to imagine any scenario other than, oh look, Golden Axe is doing really well. It's selling a
Hmm.
lot of boards. Hey, we have a Conan-style franchise that we haven't done anything with in a few years. Why don't we dust that franchise off and just like really do a Golden Axe beater? Let's take what they did, but now that the two screens side by side format is common and we have those arcade cabinet, like those, that we have that technology already in
Right.
use. Let's give it the two screen treatment, and let's make that way we can make the character sprites even bigger, and let's put some quite skillful artists on for like human anatomy and stuff like that. And obviously it was a high budget game
Right,
for
right, yeah.
back in the day, and there's a lot of that's one of the things we're going to talk about this game. Obviously, there's going to be a big graphic art analysis and critique slant to the video, but just also just going to talk about sort of the a lot of great creative decisions were made in this game, visually and for gameplay. But we're going to talk about how some of it can't be appreciated as much as should have been for a few simple decisions or sort of almost editorial. The sort of the
Right.
art director or game designer kind of dropped the ball in a couple of ways that are super easy concepts to understand. That it's really the kind of thing that a game designer and especially art directors and artists should keep in mind when they're working on a game, especially such a sort of epic project like this, where you're going to be throwing a lot of ideas into the
Hmm.
game. But before we dive into that sort of creativity aspect of things, let's get into the more sort of core nitty gritty aspects of pixel art. And obviously, there's the two things. There's what kind of detail and form you can get in within the limitation of the resolution, the actual pixels. But then the other massive thing is color usage and how nice you can make things look, and how nice and clean and clear you can get things to look within the color depth and the number of on-screen colors that you can use. And this is something that Corey and I feel was, from a sort of core pixel art standpoint, it was the one thing that really fell short in a lot of the game that
Hmm.
really make the game a lot less visually impressive and pleasant to look at than it could have been.
Right, right.
So,
Yeah,
yep, go ahead.
clearly, the rendering style of all
Mhm.
this is very nice. When you look at it, but it's clear the tones and the color usage. There's lots of things that with pretty minor tweaks you could
Yeah.
actually enhance in many ways.
Yeah, so I had set up in advance a layered image. We'll go into Art Rage here and just show you what I mean. So this is the tweaked version I have. This is the actual screenshot from the arcade.
Hmm.
And you could see there's just some things. There is so much. In general, it's good to have large areas of mostly one color scheme and value in the backgrounds because it can really help the characters and the important objects stand out. And they did that for the most part in this game, but not in the most visually appealing way and not in a way that really lends to the sense of depth, especially in the environment. Like sort of
Hmm.
pushing one environment back so that it meets the back layer more elegantly and more with a sense of depth. So, the first thing I'll point out here is you've got this nice purpley either sunrise or sunset style screen background layer, and it's very purple. But then, like, the artist knew enough to transition to a different color as it got closer to the horizon and to that sky, but they just went toward this weird drab brown, where they
Right.
actually should have picked up a lot more of that atmospheric purple hue, and that would have drastically, it would have, one, added more color, like the whole screen wouldn't be very drab grays and browns,
Hmm.
but it also would have looked more realistic and created a better illusion of depth and even better separation of the player characters and important objects from the background. And another important thing to keep in mind in general, from a sort of visual psychological standpoint, bluish colors automatically fall back. They seem less relevant and fall into the distance. And warmer colors kind of jump at you. They come
Hmm.
forward. So so yeah, I just made this tweak here where you can see I really pulled a much more direct correlation to these purple colors and blued it even more because it's often just in sort of reflected light areas. And that creates a much more subtle and nuanced color scheme that looks more realistic, and it helps all of the playable characters and all that stuff stand out even better. And a nice benefit of that is the artist then might not feel the urge to do these hyper saturated, I call the roast or fried chicken skin tone. That
Right.
was sadly all too common back in the day with, just like comic book art and sprite art.
Yeah,
Um,
it's too one tone
yeah,
for skin. Skin
yeah,
has a lot of
variety.
in the
Yeah,
based on the light. It has,
right.
and they did a little better on the lady there.
Yeah, a lot better. Yeah.
But he's just so one tone. It feels very unrealistic. Very
Right.
unnatural, and yeah,
Right, and even if someone were that color,
right.
in toward the shadows as the color gets darker, it would get a lot more muted. And Da Vinci
Hmm.
said, "Look for blue in all shadows." And you want the colors when you go into shadow; they're going to get more muted and more toward the cool side of things. And that was another very common mistake in a lot of artwork was just making the dark colors just as vivid as the light colors, but only darker. And
Right.
it's blown out. It looks unnatural. It's a very strange skin color for someone to have. And like you said, they just did a much better
Yeah,
job
it
with
kind
more
of
skin
looks like
tone.
he's got like a body paint on or something.
Right.
Like it's not a real,
Yeah,
it doesn't.
spray
Yeah,
tan bronzer. Yeah. So
yeah.
um, so yeah, you could see like making it much cooler colors as it goes into the distance, and then just really doing more of a sharper contrast, brighter highlights in the foreground, and then letting the background darken and lose contrast in the background again is going to help increase that illusion of distance. And it's really going to make you feel not only does it look more natural, but it's going to make the viewer feel that they understand which region in depth is the important one and what can be interacted
Mhm.
with and what's really relevant. And the rest should fall back and be atmospheric and make a beautiful world that's there that you're playing in without distracting from, there shouldn't be irrelevant things in the background drawing your attention away or fighting for your attention. That's what I always in these videos call, one of the aspects of confetti syndrome, when everything is so contrasty or using the same hues and level of contrast that it's not immediately
Mhm.
obvious at a glance what's important and what's not. So,
Yeah,
um,
and another
yeah.
quick thing too, like if you go back to the original, like if you were
Yep.
having to do a quick fix for this and you didn't
Mm-hmm.
have the time for the
Mm-hmm.
foreground,
Yep.
let's say for whatever reason you did need this to be a very drab color scheme.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it fits the world or the game or something.
Mm-hmm.
What you could do is also alter the sky, like make it
Right.
more drab as well, or cloudy or
Mm-hmm.
something, to make it feel like this foreground fits that sky, because
Right.
that's the real mismatch, is like you
Right.
got that nice color back there and then everything else is so not, it's
Yeah.
so plain, like it does feel like a cloudy day and there's not much light coming through in this
Right.
environment, and that's the key. So there's two ways to fix it, but
Mm-hmm.
obviously the more colorful way to really emphasize that sky is
Right.
better,
Right.
and would take more time. But this it's you see that a lot in this game. There's sort of a mismatch between like the sky, the
Right.
atmosphere they're in versus the foreground, and we'll see that as we move along.
Yeah, exactly right. Like it's clear there were several artists on this team, and
Hmm.
there wasn't enough to like really get the most mileage out of the art and really show it off as best as possible. There wasn't enough careful art directing to make sure everything was balanced nicely with each other so that everything sort of helped everything else instead of just sort of like it works. But like just another example, like you've got this really drab background, you've got this cool sort of amphibious enemy,
Hmm.
but then like obviously a creature like that is supposed to have a very shiny skin,
Right, right.
and like you've got a really good chance here to really hit that contrast and that specularity, give him some nice vivid colors that you're
Hmm.
likely to see in something like a fish or a lizard. And now he's got the same level of visual importance as the players. He pops off the background to the same degree as the players, and you're getting that sort of mileage out of the art. Like this was a cool design. It was well rendered. It's interesting. The anatomy is quite nice. Everything's cool about it, but it just kind of blends into the background.
Yeah, yeah. He looks like he's supposed to be in the back somewhere and
Exactly.
much bigger or something,
Yeah.
based on those tones. And you see that a lot throughout the game. There's a lot of
Exactly.
enemies that have that contrast issue
Right.
compared to the main characters who use that. It sort of speaks to different artists working on those sets of characters,
Right.
and it
Exactly.
never did come together in a
Right.
final pass.
Right. You'll find that very often in any kind of art. The different artists have different sensibilities and put more emphasis on different things.
Right.
Line weight or hatching versus like in like illustration, or like how much they rely on shadows, how much black ink, and it's the same with pixel arts. A lot of artists, pixel artists, some of them are toward one extreme and really punch the contrast and the saturation of colors, and really strong darks and lights, and then the others go the opposite. In this game, you clearly had both kinds of extreme artists that both were good with design and anatomy, but you had at least one artist that was low contrast by nature and one artist that
Hmm.
was high contrast by nature. And what should have happened is the art director should have, or a lead artist should have made sure that all art coming through was palette tweaked at the end to make them match in their level of contrast and saturation.
And sadly, with the amount of detail that went into this art, I mean,
You know,
changing a palette when you've only got like 16 colors or something. I mean, it doesn't take that long.
no, not
It's
at
a very
all.
quick thing,
Right,
and that's going to change every instance of that character in the
right,
game. Back in the day, at
right.
least. So
And the other thing to
yeah,
keep in mind
it's a
is
sad tragedy.
right.
With this game.
And this was a quite a powerful arcade board. I didn't get the exact info for it, but I know enough just by analyzing the long play of the game and the screenshot that they definitely had many, at least four, I think more like six or eight, 16 color palettes just for the sprites.
Right, right.
So, it's difficult if you have all the artists have to use the same 16 colors. Then you can't just tweak the palette to fix one artist's low contrast character.
Hmm.
Like you
Hmm.
literally have to tell them to redraw it or reuse the colors differently because they can't just tweak the palette. But in this
Right.
case, the artists were
Exactly.
creating
Yeah.
their own separate 16 color palette per character, so you could completely fix the lack of saturation and the lack of contrast, like in this Fishman, simply by like it doesn't even have to be the same artist. Like the artist that likes high contrast, which is better in this case for like he went way too fried chicken with the skin tone, but otherwise it just looks better when the characters and the important objects really pop like that. They could have easily had him just quickly tweak the palettes that of the art that the other guy made, and nothing would need to be redone. We're literally talking like a 20 to 30 second edit of a palette, and then
Hmm.
just everything works much better together and just looks better. And like it's really a shame because this artist that uses the low contrast, he's every bit as good in design and detail and anatomy as the other artist, but he just had a sensibility that was much less bold, and especially back in the day with blurry monitors, it really paid off to use bolder contrast and saturation. Like it's just you're going to see it better. It's going to pop better for your attention. It's just going to look nicer. So anyway, so that's it for there. There were another, before we move on away from this screen. Oh, I did want to get to your point about the other way they could have fixed it to make it stay looking more realistic, because right now, like the back sky, and like you said, that this is common in this game, you've got different artists working on different elements and then they just kind of bring them together, and sometimes it doesn't work or make sense. Like the palettes aren't balanced properly for each other. So like that sky and that environment could not exist together in the world like that, because that sky would tint, even if that was actually drab gray under that sky, it would pick up that purple tone. It would reflect that purple tone.
Yeah, well, it's clear like the guy working on the skies or whatever was over there, kind of like in isolation. Like he was. It was probably a matter of like, hey, we need like all these different skies,
nice skies,
and there was no like, hey, it's gonna go with this,
right.
And then the guy doing the tile sets for the main foreground stuff, it's like they were just probably not. For whatever reason, there wasn't communication there. There's lots of reasons these things happen.
Right.
Budget, whatever, but. It's kind of clear that
the bigger the team you have and the more artists you have, kind of just like machine gun doing different elements that are going to be all used together in different ways by the game designer and the level designer and stuff, you can end up falling into that thing where it's like, oh well, I'm just going to make something that looks good on its own and that doesn't have any super specific, like in the case of the foreground tile set, its lighting and its coloring is so sort of middle of the ground, it'll sort of work with anything. So that's kind of safe, but also it's never going to look great.
Right.
And like what you were saying, I remember my point now with, like, you could make an overcast drab sky that'll work better as far as realistically, atmospherically with this foreground tile set. But what I would say is, even if you're going to go that way, and obviously it's dangerous to decide to make the whole game or even just a level just like very bland and drab, that's usually but even if you want an overcast and a like gray thing, since you've lost the ability to have contrast in color to keep things interesting, all the more important to be thinking about contrast of value, light and shadow. So if they were going to go this way, what they really should have done, like if they wanted a gray overcast sky for this, they really needed to give way more thought to large areas of shadow to separate out and create a lot more interest and depth. And that's another big thing. Like I did that to some extent with this environment. Oops, cancel. Like you could see where I created sort of a middle band. If you could see my mouse pointer, I'll grab a brush tool here. So, hidden. I'm drawing on a hidden layer. That doesn't work. All right. So from here, basically that covered the whole thing. But like I darkened this sort of middle area, and what that does is it just helps separate the foreground from a mid area, and then you've got back to a relatively light sky. And this idea of separating the environment into big areas of a relative theme, a relative that can be for texture, it can be for light and dark, it can be color, or all of the above. And it's just going to make a more pleasant screen, an environment that the characters are going to pop off better from.
Right, yeah.
And it just keeps things more interesting. You don't want that sort of everything's like a spattered, dithery, medium tone for the whole screen, which the original version definitely suffers from.
Yeah, it's too many very similar tones and grays
and colors
like that. It just it doesn't. It definitely even more so than just the depth. It just needs. It needs more variety. I mean, like you mentioned before with me, like there's that slight greenish grass they worked
Yeah,
in there,
exactly.
but it looks kind of half dead, and
Yeah,
it
you
just
can't even
doesn't. It's
notice
not
it.
enough to
Yeah,
really separate it. And like you punched up that green, and it really helped. Like
yeah,
now you see it,
right,
and exactly, you have to always keep that in mind too. It's not always about realism. You
right,
do have to exaggerate a lot of times with your colors
right.
and shapes and everything to sell the experience,
Yeah,
you
and
know?
it's about finding that balance, right?
Right.
Like in general, I give this advice a lot to artists, especially for like character design or object design. If you're going to add something, then you should sort of play it for all it's worth, right? Like
Right.
if a
Hmm.
character has whatever, a pouch on them or whatever, or a belt, make sure that like there's something really interesting to that thing and that you can really see it. It really adds to the character.
Hmm.
And it's the same thing with the environment. You're going to bother adding these tufts of grass. And yes, you don't want them so like neon nuclear green that they're fighting for
Right.
your attention. That you're like, oh my god, what is that? If I step on that, do I get hurt? Is it a puddle of acid? Like obviously you don't go that far, but you can find a balance between, oh, like I can see it now. If I look, I can recognize it as a green tuft of grass, and it's helping break up that monotonous gray,
Yeah,
right?
and even if you wanted it a little more yellowish, like
Absolutely,
it's
yeah.
not the healthiest grass, you could still find the right tones to get it to pop off of that stone,
Right,
without it,
right,
it just blends in too much in the original. So
right,
that's
exactly.
a good example of like how something is kind of getting lost at a glance
Right,
when clearly they spent time putting that grass detail in there. The artist did,
right,
and it just it's kind of only half there, you know.
right. And then the last thing, last topic that was on my mind with this screen. Oh, another thing. Let's look at the HUD and
Right.
the text especially. In
Hmm.
some screens, I think I have a timestamp written down somewhere. I'll try to find that later. But all the fonts back then, all the text on screen, it was just graphics, and it's clear that it was not one color graphics in the arcade, or certainly didn't need to be. Like I
Hmm.
saw some, I think, hand done anti-aliasing in it, so they could have easily worked in a drop shadow, which would make
Yeah, and
it
I think that example was about 27 minutes or so into the video,
okay.
28 minutes,
Okay,
if you wanted to jump there. But
yeah.
yeah,
Let's see if
I
we
know
can
what you
find
mean.
it.
Like sometimes it just doesn't. It's just a solid color. They worked some different values into it to give it some sort of
There we
anti-aliased
go.
effect. But
Yeah.
yeah, you see, there's a perfect,
So
you
you could
know,
see that this becomes nearly unreadable, and like they anti-aliased it by hand, building it into the graphics to anti-alias into a dark color. And then
right,
that looks terrible when the background is a light color instead of a dark color. So the way to fix that is to not anti-alias the light edge and then just put a nice dark drop shadow under, and then you can read it no matter what the situation is, and it just looks better as well as being more readable.
yeah. And this could be a case because on some of the in between screens, they've got this text on like a black background,
Right.
So I'm thinking they probably designed it that
Based
way.
on the black
And
background.
then when they were putting together the game, they just took the font they had and it didn't think
Right.
much about it and just dropped it in there. Which
Yep.
clearly, usually in game, you want to make sure that text is going to be actually more important because you're seeing it all the
Exactly.
time. So
Exactly.
that's you want to design it for that screen.
Yep.
So
Yep. And oh, this was another good example. I won't take the time to like load it into a graphics program, but this was another great example. We had discussed this earlier.
hmm
Corey and I did. This is a fast scrolling level,
hmm
and you don't want a repetitive, harsh patterned, fast moving thing to be on screen that is going to just be kind of nauseating and distract you from the important elements of gameplay. And in
right,
this case, you have this very bright yellow sky silhouetted by these very dark trees, which can be fine, especially if it's a low scrolling. Like if you're gonna do that, it would have been nice to add some rim light to the trees back there to tie the lighting together. But again, like we were talking about, it's like one guy did skies and one guy did foregrounds, and they
Right.
kind of
Right.
just slapped them together. But they could have tied that in better. But especially for an environment like this, that's just the whole thing is scrolling by really fast. A more balanced sky that's less contrasty, and then tying in, like if they really atmosphered out the backmost trees more, that would have helped a lot. And then
Hmm.
just building into the art, just drawing in a bit of a blurriness and a motion blur could have looked amazing, especially into the furthest back trees and you know, the back trees, so that it works well with the sky. But then the other thing is, this is another perfect example of, look how flat and vertical the foreground environment looks. There's not a big sense of depth. And
Right.
again, you've got like 88% of the screen, to pull a random number out of my butt, it's just all the same medium to dark tone, all the same kind of
Hmm.
dithery texture for the most part, and all like a drab gray. And this would have been a perfect, even if you want that overcastness, this would have been the perfect time to just use the sort of anatomy of the environment. You've got this tree canopy, you've got this forest. So cast a nice dark shadow on the edge of this forest to really
Right.
help separate the sort of mid ground, or the background of the foreground, if that makes sense, from the foreground. And then they could have taken some of that nice saturated sky color and highlight and add reflected light to the foreground, so that you've got, again, this sort of almost built-in subtle spotlight on the area of the foreground
Right.
that is the playable area that is important. It would look so much better. It would look so much more interesting, more natural. And again, it's that idea of separating the environment. It not only does it look better into like areas of theme, large areas of one color. Your characters are going to stand up better. It's like that's like the biggest thing that we're going to talk about over and over again for this game is there's no there's too much going on in sort of like all over the screen, so
Right.
to
Right.
speak,
Yeah.
and having the sort of sensibility to break things up and let large things or themed things breathe, and yeah, like you'll
Yeah,
see that
the
over and over
game
again.
is
Yeah,
this game is fast.
yeah.
Like the action is so quick.
Hmm.
It's almost like the level of detail is so high, and even the resolution with the double screen. It's like I can imagine people playing this and going, oh, like getting a bit frazzled.
Yeah.
But you can see here like this foreground stuff by itself. Like if you
Hmm.
removed that yellow sky, it's like I can see how the artist who made it was thinking, oh, I'm doing kind of a moonlit
Right.
like kind of a moonlit forest here. And by
Right.
itself, it's like, okay, that's not too bad by itself. But the minute you add in that yellow sky, and then
Right.
the characters who don't change in tone,
Right.
you've got kind of a lighting profile based on your main characters and everything.
Right.
And it's almost like all of it's a mismatch. The main characters, the horses,
Right.
the enemies, it's like they're all being hit by different light.
Right.
And that's the real thing going on here, other than just the general use of of tones and the ways that the skin tones could
Right.
look more realistic. Other than that, it's like yeah, they all have different. It's like if you were in a 3D program, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you had isolated lights on each
Mhm.
object. That's what you would
A
get.
different
You
light
get this
source for
effect.
everything. Yeah, and
Right.
that's like Rastan is the only character that looks like he could actually be under that sky. But then the whole
Exactly.
forest doesn't look like it's under that
Right.
sky, and then all the other characters don't, and then the horses are too dull and drab without dark enough shadows in their underbelly, except for this overall dark horse. You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah, you made the point perfectly well. So yeah, and yeah, so the drop shadows. Was there anything else in that image file that I wanted? Oh, one last point is sense of scale. We talked about how this
Right.
character is cool and stuff, but at the same time, and you'll see this in like if you look at the actual long play of the game, he seems oddly big for the type of character he is.
Hmm.
And then, sort of to make matters worse, it's a mostly cool design, but there's like if a creature has really thin, spindly legs and stuff like that, they can only get away with that. Like the smaller a creature is, the more it can get away with that. Like
Right,
this thing
right,
is bigger than human. It's massive, and then it's got these spindly limbs, and it's got this super thick torso. And
right.
like that's not a very sensible design for that character to be able to get around. And so, like you see in my tweak, not only did I tweak the colors, but I just added a little more anatomy detail to the abdomen and brought in his abdomen a bit.
Hmm.
So, and I thickened his thighs a little bit, so he feels a little bit more like he'd be able to move around more nimbly on the land. And but anyway, just in general, he looks too big compared to like for the type of creature he is.
Yeah,
And,
he seems a little. I don't know. I don't want to use maybe like wimpy. Like he looks like a because he's one of the first enemies you see, right? So he's
right,
like he's kind of a low tier, not important
right, exactly.
enemy. Seems like easy to take out. Yeah, it just seems like he should have been a little smaller based on the design and just the general
Right.
emotional sense you get from him. He doesn't look super
Yeah,
threatening. Why is he so big? You
he
know?
is right. He is literally out of his element. He's a fish
Right,
man that clearly evolved to be mostly in the water, and he's on land. So
right,
it would make sense to go with that theme. And he is an enemy that you can is one of the first you see, one of the easiest to beat, just like you said. It would make perfect sense for him to not seem oddly huge compared to the other characters and the enemies. And then the other thing for scale that's even worse, let's say I know, yeah, there was one right there that just got destroyed. The barrels in this game and the crates actually are both oddly small. Yeah, so for scale, it's just these crates, I'm guessing what happened was they were like, oh, sprites on almost all classic arcade boards, and I think all actually, and consoles and arcade boards. A sprite was 16 pixels wide or 32 and stuff like that, in multiples of 16 for sure. And it was like, okay, it makes sense to fit a crate within a certain width, but this arcade board is very powerful. And if you can fit, if you can plaster six barrels of one size on the screen, but they're all oddly a bit small, wouldn't
right,
it be
right,
way better to have four proper sized barrels on the screen? So let
right.
me
Mhm.
find. So these crates, they feel a little weird, a little small for sure. Like a shipping crate made
Well,
out
they
of,
would see. It's like they would look fine, kind of up there against that wall. Like they look
exactly.
further back.
Yes.
But something tells me that the person making the crates of bear, like
Yeah.
they didn't see the place it was going to be or anything.
Right.
Like they didn't know. They were just kind of
Right.
they were making it, and
Yeah,
so
and so
as with many things in this game.
it's
So
all three issues combined. It's scale, they're too small. It's contrast, their darks aren't dark enough, so they don't have the same level of contrast as everything in the foreground should. Everything you can interact with, the players, the enemies, things you can destroy, things you can pick up, they should all have a nice, bold level of contrast. And those are drab and too small, and their
mhm.
colors aren't as saturated as they could be. And so all three things combined, it looks like someone copy and pasted crates from the background and just
Right.
dragged it down into the foreground. It doesn't look like those are nice big beefy shipping crates. Like
Well, and
look at
even
their
still,
construction.
like I can be a little more accepting of the crates because I can imagine a smaller crate,
Sure,
but
sure.
still, like the barrels is when it really
Yeah.
becomes obvious,
Let me
like that
find
is
there they
even
are.
the issue with the crates because yeah, they're
Those are tiny. Let
hmm
me enlarge the screen so you could get a feel for that. Look at that; it wouldn't even come up to her waist,
right.
like if she were standing on the same level. And it's all the easier for us these days. We've got Google and stuff like that. But wine barrels and barrels that were often used for transport and shipping and stuff like that back then, they were big. People were known to get in them, hide in them, go over Niagara Falls in them, stuff like that.
Right,
they
right.
they're big. They're not gargantuan, but those feel weirdly small as do the crates, and it just detracts from. And my point was, if you have so many sprites, you want to be able to use 4 crates. This is a high action fighting game with a lot of big enemies on screen and 2 players simultaneously. Why would you be worried? Oh no, but I really, really need to put 8 barrels on screen, so make them all weirdly small if you have to, just so we can have 8 on screen. Like, they're just crates. Wouldn't it be better to only be able to have 4 on screen, but they're the right size? Like, do you ever really need for your level? No, this level design.
We watched this all the way through. I don't think there's any instance of that many on screen ever. There's like this. There's a few barrels here, but you know,
and
they don't go nuts with it.
Right, and my point is, if you're designing a cool, epic Conan-style Dungeons and Dragons influenced fighting game, and your level design demands that you plaster the screen with barrels, you're doing something wrong.
Right.
Because they're inanimate, they're not a threat to you. One slash and they're shattered. Like, the barrels should have very little to do with your level design, except that.
Right. I mean, unless your story, you know, like involves Barrel World, you know, or something. I know what you mean. Like those are instances that are easily avoidable from a game design standpoint.
It's a strange technical decision that you're going to allow your barrels, as soon as they put them in the level, a barrel, they should have said, you know what, go up another sprite and width usage, because they look oddly small right now. And I just will never put so many on that we get a bunch of sprite flicker between the barrels and the players. Like, it was a needless quote-unquote optimization to fit the barrels within a certain number of sprites.
And two, just from this is a beat 'em up game. You want that nice action. It's going to be more rewarding to smash something bigger, anyways. You know, you don't feel good breaking that barrel. You know, like you don't feel strong. It's like.
And the smaller the barrel is, the more you feel weak and dumb when it just like stops you dead in your tracks. You know, like you walk into a barrel that small and you're a Rastan, it's just going to fall over and roll away. You know what I mean?
You could just step on it, you know?
Yeah, you literally step up on it. It's so small. It's so small that it's a bit silly. It's not something you pay attention to in the game, but subconsciously all of these things, again, it's like I said, it's a well-drawn barrel. Its contrast is too low, its size is too small. All of these things make good art kind of get either ignored or not lend to the coolness of the game the way it could have. Just like punching the contrast of that fish man made you able to appreciate how cool it was in its design and made it look, you know, more intimidating and more relevant. And you know, everything is
it's like you were alluding to, like a lot of these things are very subconscious for people. Like they'll see something and they won't know why. You know what I mean? They won't quite catch why they don't like something, you know, but we know these things as artists, like all of these things will impact people whether they realize it or not, you know.
So the one last point I want to make about environment art or big point, which ties into another variant of confetti syndrome, and sort of that idea of getting the most mileage. If you're going to add something, then make that thing really contribute and do well and add to the appeal. And the problem with the architecture here is that, like, let's look at these foundation bricks here.
Right.
They've got this near pillow shading, and it goes to super dark on the outline of every brick.
Right.
So instead of seeing, this is especially true in the architectural what is it called? Sort of the embellishment, the ornamentation, like the doorway. Instead of appreciating like a nice, you know, side column going up either side of the doorway and then an arch, it's just like, I'm a brick, I'm a brick, I'm a brick, I'm a brick. It's and like there's I'm a bricks all over that building.
Right.
Like
and none of them feel like they emphasize where they are. It's like the ones on the side are the same as the ones at the base, the same as the ones around the windows and the doors, and they all just feel you know, unimportant, when clearly you can see there's a lot of different tiles and art going on there. And they had the ability to embellish, but they just It was kind of a quick, oh, I've got to make a building,
Yeah, it's someone didn't
So,
take the time to like, and it was harder back then. There was not the internet and Google,
right,
but there
right,
were libraries, and you could
right.
find awesome architectural books on medieval architecture, and a lot of it was gorgeous. And
Mm,
even like a relatively poor person's house back in the day, they had nice contrast. They had elements. They had beams and they had stucco. They were smart enough to put stucco here to break up the monotony of all the bricks. That's great. But it's the same exact tone and color as the
yep.
main color in the bricks. And there's no texture in it at all, which is a little bit of a shame. But anyway, it's just when you're designing a floor, make it a floor that if you look closely has contributing smaller details. But
Mhm.
like if you look at this stone floor, you've got this extreme near pillow shading separating every stone to a very large degree, and you could tell they were like drawn as separate flat stones and then kind of stamped on top of each other. Like it doesn't
Yeah,
even make anatomical sense, so to speak. They're some of them are overlapping each other too much, and your floor would look so much nicer, more natural, and would it would be less distracting and less confetti syndrome, and you could get a better
hmm
sense of perspective if you overall had look a nice stone floor, but it was overall or a ground, and then every aspect of its anatomy wasn't fighting for equal attention.
yeah, and then you have the scale issue too, where it's like the stones at the top of the
Yeah, they're not
floor
getting
are the same as the bottom. Like
right,
you don't get a sense of like that's going into the distance,
right,
and it doesn't take a ton of work because you clearly have a tile thing going on here as certain sections repeated.
right.
It's it's funny because this is a case of they had the amount of colors to work with,
Yep,
clearly. And they decided to use all these similar grays, and they could have reduced that by a lot,
yep,
injected a little bit more color and really emphasized the things that mattered, but
right,
still, it doesn't take that much work, especially with environment work. Things that aren't even animated, you're drawing them once and they're
right,
finished. So
yep,
th- you know, I can forgive a lot of flaws in the characters sometimes because that's a lot
right,
of animation, and these characters are highly animated. I mean, they move
right,
around. There's a lot of frames, but the environments that don't move, it's like, hey, like that's your one shot to
right,
impress somebody.
right.
So yeah, it's
Yeah, you're drawing like a tile set. You don't have to animate
right,
every
right,
tile like you have to animate a character to do all the different moves. You
yep,
draw it and you're done. Make it nice, make it count.
yep,
And like another great example of this, and just the drabness, like making everything or close to everything the same medium tone, except for these kind of garish, overdone, like pillow shading dark outlines. Look at that. They had a great fake perspective on that door opening into the building in the rubble. They could have gradiated the shading of that door as it goes into that darkness and really gotten a
yeah, a little
much
more. I mean, it does a
a
little, but it's
little, a
not enough.
little.
It's
Yeah, like that could have looked really cool and atmospheric, and it really added a sense of interest and depth back there without distracting too much. It just would look better. And the same thing, like that doorway, make it a doorway. Don't make it, I'm a brick, I'm a brick, I'm a brick going around the, like, and if you want to see a master class for how to do that kind of environment stuff right, and even when you have an all gray castle to just make it look just beautiful, look at our previous forensic pixology hidden
hmm
treasure video of Nightmare Busters. That was those and however many environment artists were on that team just did a stellar job
Oh
of
yeah.
just really keeping things pretty and interesting and breaking things up into again that idea of you can have horizontal areas of a theme of a certain general value of a certain direction of the texture. There's a like a pirate ship like inside
hmm
the ship.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
there's an inside of the ship in this game too, and you can clearly see the
like
difference
compare the
between
difference.
the design. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, there's a different style overall,
right.
but yeah, they cared a lot more, and that, like they made it
Yeah,
interesting. Whereas you'll see quite a lot in this game. There's
yeah,
they it's the stuff is there,
yeah,
and there just could have been not much extra effort put into the embellishment, and it would have
Right.
really shined.
Yeah, this is so true in almost all kinds of art. That little bit of extra knowledge and attention to detail to realize how relevant, how important these ideas are.
Right.
Like, don't make a doorway that's just a bunch of the same bricks all over, especially because, like you said, they're clearly made out of different tiles. Like, they look
Hmm.
exactly the same to the human eye, but if you really analyze them, they're a little narrower. They've got different cracks. Those are all new tiles. They could have made them look however they want, but they
Hmm.
were just sort of cookie cutter, literally just brick, 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 and way too much a individual brick,
And
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 then
it could have even been a case of, yeah, maybe when they reached this point they were running low on tiles, but that's one of those balance issues where
right,
something in this level somewhere else is taking up a lot of space
yeah,
that maybe they could have worked out better or swapped it
yeah,
out in and out of memory better. So that those are things to keep in mind for sure when you're designing environments for
right.
retro stuff. But if that was the case, then it could have started that conversation of, okay, what's here that's taken up, like, is that sky, like, is that like a really big graphic when it doesn't need to be nearly as
Right.
big, considering the space it's taken up. There's things like that you got to balance
Yeah,
as you're
exactly.
designing this. So.
Yeah, so on that note, let's move
Hmm.
to a part of the game when we're talking about a mismatch of different artists and art directing within one game. Let's skip to, like, look, this looks like a different game.
Yeah, yeah.
This looks like a, different artist, different art direction, same character sprites. And now they pop beautifully. The game looks so much more modern, almost too much toward the other extreme, so it's jarring. It looks more cartoony because of that.
Hmm.
But this general, like, they could have added more detail, but this general sensibility, like, you could see there's these large
Yep.
areas of a theme, a color scheme. You have the water, and then you have this beautiful large area in a horizontal band of the reflection and shadow of the kind of briar, whatever that is, these tree-like things growing out of the water. You've got this really nice separating region of all the dark greens, and nothing's high contrast, but everything reads so well. Nothing's too distracting. Every important object shows so well, and it just looks more vibrant and interesting. There should have been a little more detail added into things and a little more texture added to, like, rippling the water, especially this area is feeling really naked up here.
Right, right. Yeah.
But in general, like, look how nice this looks and how easy things stand out. And, like, look, you've got these, again, the mass of ground. You've got this color scheme of the
Hmm.
more warm greens.
They even worked in a little bit of mossy green into the
Mm,
bottom of that vinage stuff back there. It's
yep,
like there's some nice subtle changes of color with
right,
the clearly the same hardware, limitations, whatever,
right,
and it was just completely absent from a lot of the other environments. So
yeah,
it might have been a different artist, but either way, like it's a good example of what you can do even with so little. They even worked
right.
in a little bit of greenish tone into that water at the bottom, like a
Yeah,
fade
yep,
there.
yep,
And they
absolutely.
didn't have to, but they
Mhm.
did to make it appear more marshy or
Yeah.
what have you.
And again,
And
the
it's
warmer color pulls it forward, right?
hmm
Like, if they
yep,
stayed really blue, it kind of falls back, especially when
right,
you've got this warmer, darker green. You've got this risk that that's no longer going to feel like water, that it's going to feel like it's like in the distance. It's not actual water that you're stepping in. So the ways they could have fixed that is make it darker and warmer and add more surface reflection, like ripples to the water.
right, right.
And then it would have brought it forward and made it more obvious. But and that would have matched the overall style of the rest of the levels better. But still, I just wanted to point out, like, the
Hmm.
very different sensibility. It's like a totally different artist was brought on at some point to do this environment than all of the other artists. And one last point on this particular level while we're here, because I saw this idea I wanted to bring up of, yeah, just going back to that idea of getting the most mileage out of your art.
Hmm.
The sprite art for the dragons is pretty cool. It's not bad. The design is good. But every last bump of scale on his skin is so high contrast that you're starting to see those details more than the overall form.
Right.
If the
Yeah.
overall shading on the dragon head were done first, and then scales were drawn carefully into it without just like blowing out the shading and the rendering of the entire shape of the skull, it could have looked a lot better. But still, it's pretty good. And then, like with this technology, this technique was used a lot back in the day to have characters with long necks or tails, making it out of a bunch of sprites that are the same ball image.
Right. Yeah.
But the problem is, this artist rendered it too much like a perfect sphere with the shading, with the dark shadow going perfectly up around. And
Right.
that could have looked a lot better if he didn't bring the
It could
shadow
have.
up the side
Well,
so severely. Yep.
yeah, I was gonna say, considering how they're stacked in front of each other like
Yeah.
that, the inverse sort of lighting, like almost a top rim-like lighting, where the
Yeah.
shadow's going up a little higher, it would have blended the bottom a little more,
Yeah.
and it might have looked a little nicer and not been so like
Jarring. Yeah.
obvious that these things are.
Right.
I mean, it's gonna be obvious no matter what, but
Right.
yeah, they're
It
so
could be way
obviously
less
smeared.
obvious.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And this is a boss fight, right? You're going to be paying attention to the heads. The next segments
right.
are going to be moving constantly. So the more you can hide that, like lower the contrast, those black, very circular shadows on the bottom
Hmm.
was really the big problem. And it could have been drastically improved, and that issue could have been drastically reduced. But then the other big thing, you've got your environment art. They didn't use a ton of tiles for this environment. You know, in your design, you're gonna have these dragons' heads, their necks poking out of this like briar patch or whatever it is, these water trees. Why not design the tiles so that there's room for a dragon's head and neck and body to be back there? They just literally plopped them haphazardly over the
Hmm.
tile set. It makes no actual sense in 3D space. There's nowhere for that neck to be coming from. There's no way it could be attached to a body. And that really kills the cool factor of this boss fight. It's just these disembodied heads and necks floating around.
Yeah, they feel like you see what they're going for, but it doesn't look
Yeah.
like it at all. Like they're just kind of
Yeah.
there. Like they
Yeah.
don't blend into that background. It wouldn't have taken much to
No,
work
like
in some extra tiles or something back
right.
there to
If
sell, you know.
if you're gonna have this pitch black undershadow on the dragon, make it pitch black or almost pitch black right here, and you could taper it to the slightly lighter colors, and then just have these trees and stuff wrap around a physical space big enough for the body to be. Like, you don't have to see a space big enough for the whole body, but you need to get the sense that there's an opening inside there, like a nesting area big enough for the
Yeah.
dragon. And then like that's the really big thing. And then they could have done a cool thing at the beginning if they had just had that thought process. They could have done this cool thing where they could have had, like, at first you get there, the scrolling stops, so you know a boss fight is coming, maybe even hear a cool dragon waking up noises or whatever, and then you could have seen dragon eyes open up in the shadows, and then, had the dragon
Hmm.
heads come out with very little new art.
Yeah, and it's because this is such an epic sort of scene that they wanted to give. This boss
Right.
was clearly a cool idea. It's like, it definitely deserves that treatment. Like that intro,
Right.
that it don't. Well, I guess obviously there's always time and budget issues, but it's
Right.
just, yeah, I'm looking at it like, wow, this was deserving of so that little
Right.
extra work, and it would have been amazing,
Right.
way more amazing than it's still cool,
Right,
but it's
right.
it's not
Uh,
quite there.
right.
It's getting very close to the finish line, but not
Yeah.
not quite there.
Right, yeah, it's like to make a pun on the spheres for the neck. They dropped the ball when it came to just a few different things. It could have made this. It could have pulled this off so much better.
Because
And
that head of those
yeah.
dragons is so like cool,
Yeah,
like
it's
you
nicely done.
want
Yeah.
you want to imagine the rest of the scene that way, and it's
Yeah.
it didn't quite get there, but
There's also an unfortunate Z order issue with this final
right,
ball. It should never ever be in front of the head. There
right,
was
yeah,
no need for that, and that just ruins But I mean, the other thing too that I want to quickly mention is like the same exact amount of work. There were more nuanced things in this very level that they spent time on that would have been better spent for really making this boss fight pay off.
Yeah,
Like
I
it
agree.
wouldn't have taken any extra time if they knew they were going to have this dragon boss come out of these briar type things. They could have designed the tile set in the first place so that there would have been good places for the dragons to be coming out of the heads.
Yep.
And yeah, stuff like that. And then the other thing that annoys me, and this was just a decision in the game, when you hit the boss heads, they flash this incredibly hideous.
Yeah.
It looks like a graphical glitch. They could have made that much more tasteful. They could have just flashed like a brightening color or a reddening color. Like you're literally just changing the palette from a set of RGB values to another for that particular sprite. There's no reason, or you're pointing those sprites to use a different palette.
Even if all they did was just change that blue to
Yeah,
like
it's too
another
much.
one of those grays or something,
Yeah,
that would have been infinitely better. Like that
yeah.
blue is what it's like. I don't get it.
It
You know,
looks
like
like
I
a
don't really get.
graphical, yeah.
Yeah.
It looks like a graphical glitch. It does not look like it was done intentionally. And the other thing too, you don't even necessarily have to rely. I mean, understand it's universal, like arcade
Hmm.
visual communication that an enemy flashes to let you know, yes, you damaged it. That's great. They could have done that better, and they didn't have to rely on that completely. You've got these heads that are programmatically attached to these necks that follow them everywhere you go. So when
Right.
you score a damaging hit on these dragon heads, the dragon head should reel quickly away from the point of damage and then kind of ease back into wanting to attack you. That kind
Right.
of visceral, like, ouch, like, like reeling back, what is that called? Flinching, basically.
Yeah.
Movement would have sold it in a really cool, natural, cinematic way. Relying purely on that would have been way better than that really graphic glitch looking flash.
And
Excuse me.
that's universal too. I think on all the
The
bosses,
whole game,
it's
yeah.
that same
Yeah.
palette. You
Yeah.
know, it's obvious. I don't know who chose those colors, but it was a
Yeah.
weird choice. You know.
Yeah. So, and again, like they have this cool stuff. They bother to put in the extra work of making the head sort of melt, which doesn't really make sense, but it was a kind of cool effect that I'm sure a lot of young people appreciated playing the game.
Hmm.
Those lucky enough to have this in their local arcade. But like I was like, that's a lot of frames right there, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
things in the game that there's a lot of art, there's a lot of frames, but it doesn't really pay off, and there's other things they could have spent their time on that just really would have had a bigger impact and just raised the sort of cool factor. All right, while we have this long play up, we might as well just quickly scan through and take a quick look and make any comments about these other levels. There's the ship that you were talking about.
Hmm.
Really, please, everyone, if you're interested in this stuff, take a look at our other forensic pixology video for Nightmare Busters to see how beautifully a ship that's all made of wood can look. And again, breaking it up into these areas of light and dark, and some wood textures going vertical, some going horizontal or vertical. It can go so far and just looks so much better. At least this is relatively balanced. That wood color could exist in that kind of sky. Like
Yeah,
this
and I
is
do
yeah,
love that creative transition.
yeah,
Going to the
absolutely,
boss. The boss itself is weird,
yeah,
weird design, but not
yeah,
terrible.
yeah,
But yeah, like you said, lots of good ideas,
yeah,
and that's not terrible water there either. It looks nice
right,
and you know, but it's just things not quite coming together.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
that
And a lot of times, and don't get us wrong, we think this game looks really
right.
fun. There's a lot of
Oh
awesome
yeah,
creativity. Like the gameplay design seems really good, and we're not just sort of crapping on the game.
right.
And the artists we think are very good. And a lot of times this comes down to your budget of money and time.
Hmm.
And a lot of times the artists never have a chance to go back and readdress the art once they see how the game designers and level designers put it to use. And
Right.
that's a thing that can drastically, it can like literally, it sounds like I'm exaggerating, it can quintuple the visual quality of your game if you give the artist or artists that have made the artwork time to see it working in game and actually go back in and spend a day or two tweaking these things now that they see how it's all working together. And unfortunately, that was often something that was not allowed for budget and time constraints.
It's true.
And yeah,
And that's the funny thing is that, in the concept of everyone having their roles, and you've got a programmer,
hmm
maybe on the other side of wherever,
hmm
that you don't get to see or talk to very often, making the builds, right?
right,
So maybe you wouldn't have that interaction, like you would want.
right,
However, you know, we say these things because even if you don't have that opportunity, a good artist can at least look ahead and say, okay, I need to take some of these elements and compare them to
right.
things that exist. So you can at least mitigate it if you don't get that chance, because you
Yep,
might not always. Sometimes you don't. That's an extra layer of effort by everyone, but
yep,
but it's still like any art director or anyone who is gonna see it to the end is gonna be able to, or producer even, can
right.
look at these things and say, okay, we've got to do another quick, yeah, here clearly this needs changing, this, so on and so forth. So it doesn't take that much effort. It just, you've got
Right.
to you got to have that time. Something tells me that they got all the elements in place in this game,
Right.
and maybe they just didn't have that chance. Like
Yeah, exactly.
they had to get it together, and they had to get it out there. So
Right. And the reason we're mentioning it is if you have the foresight to check these things as you're going, then
mhm.
it doesn't increase your time spent. Like it doesn't take long.
Right,
It's
right,
like when
right,
you and I worked at Glue Mobile, we could get up and go see what the other one person was doing, especially if we were on the same team
hmm
doing art. We could literally see what the other person is doing, and that could influence each other. And oh, he's doing this like this, or this is the general lighting sensibility or rendering style, and
right,
adapt on the fly during the development process. It's a really big mistake. Like if you're the overall producer of the game and you're delegating and telling one artist to do this and they live on other sides of the planet, the great thing is we have the internet now, and it's way better to let everybody see what everyone else is doing, especially from the art department side,
right.
because you'll end up with a better looking and more cohesive game. So that's the point. Like if you wait until the end, almost no game project is going to have the time and the budget to let the artist go back and like really perfect everything for the way it ended up being used. But if you're doing it on the fly, like if they get to see stuff as it develops, then they're getting more and more in tune with each other and the way things will be used, and just you end up not needing like a big iterative end stretch of time to make these kind of improvements, but you end up with a very similar result, just a higher quality to keep these things in mind and to make sure all the artists see their stuff in action and together, most importantly, as the game develops.
Yeah, it's from both ends, because you got a good artist should always be aware of these things as they
Yeah.
work along, but also like from the other end, if
Mhm.
you're putting together the build and
Right.
you notice some of this stuff, but like maybe they don't know, maybe the
Right.
artist just isn't aware. Sometimes, it doesn't hurt to bring it up. It's
Yeah.
not going to hurt anybody's feelings. Most professional artists,
Right.
we hey we in fact, changing and tweaking color palettes to be cohesive is one of the most fun aspects
Yeah.
of all of this.
And
I
it's
think.
very rewarding. Most professional artists are going to have their feelings hurt a lot more when they finally see the finished game and everything looks, half as good as it could have if they were
Right,
just shown it months ago and could have made those really fast tweaks to things like palettes.
right, right.
So yeah, yeah. Don't worry if you're working with a an artist that's worked on other game projects. They like very specific feedback, or at the very least, even if you don't know what that specific, if you're a completely non-artistic person, but you feel like something doesn't look as good as it could, have the courage to say that. Don't worry about hurting their feelings and say, I don't know why, but look at this now that the art's all together. I feel like it's missing something or it could look better somehow. What do you think? You know?
And this screen right here, it's like
Yeah.
there, like I pointed out before, there's the one enemy, the blue guy in the top left, that is the high contrast enemy that's
Yep.
very closely resembles the main characters, and no other enemy in the game looks like that.
Yeah.
It was probably done by a different artist
Exactly.
or something. So yeah, you like this is one of those cases, like you've got the build and you've got this, and it's like something like what's different about that guy or the other guys.
Right.
Something's not right here. Even if you don't exactly know what to say,
Yeah.
you can still show, like, take this snapshot, show it to them, be like, there's something that's not right about this.
Right.
An artist will see that and go, oh, I know exactly what's wrong, and they'll go to work. You know,
Yeah.
it won't take much. So
And this particular artist that had the sensibility to do low contrast, if you look at the actual design work, I think he's actually slightly better than the other artist in overall
Right.
design and detail.
Mhm.
But that low contrast thing is letting the other artist's work totally steal the thunder. They grab your attention
Yep.
so much more, and you can see and appreciate the details immediately because they're in high contrast. Whereas his subtle details, they're beautiful, but especially on an old blurry CRT monitor in a high action, fast moving arcade machine, you're never going to be able to appreciate all the awesome work he put into that detail because it's too low contrast. And because you have high contrast things fighting for your attention over it. So
Right.
yeah, that imbalance. This I just noticed. I think this is the same exact tile set and sky as the horse level,
Oh yeah,
with
yeah.
with palette
Reuse.
changes. And so again, like I used the term vertical before. It's
Yeah.
losing. It doesn't have a big sense. That's supposed to be a flat ground going off into the distance, but it really feels a lot more like it's a wall or it's halfway in between a
Yeah,
vertical wall.
yeah, and it's got the same tones as the trees,
Exactly.
and it feels, yeah,
They could have had a highlighted ground area in the foreground. Let it get toward a nice deep shadow of the canopy of the trees in the mid area that will break up the background from the foreground. And then the only other thing they had to do was reserve like two colors in that
Yep.
palette of that layer to add rim lighting. So whatever color the sky was, you tweak those two indexes, those two colors, to tie in the sky background with the foreground with those trees, right?
Yep. Yep. And another trick too, if you clearly you've only got so many colors that you can work with here, and you need these browns, these sort of sandy colors they've got here for the trees and the ground.
Right.
You wouldn't need but a couple values to work into one or the other
Right.
to make it feel like a completely different color, even if a lot of the values are the same.
Yeah, it's
That's a trick,
exactly,
That's
and it's
yeah.
It's really sad because they obviously had one such color. Do you see this more orange brown? It's right there, like, but they use it in the ground only sparingly, and the trees only sparingly.
Yep.
So they had the
Could have been
index.
done,
They could
yeah.
have just used it only in the ground and not in the trees and put a lot more of it in the ground. And then it would have felt like, even though it was only one color index being used in one and not the other, it would have made the whole ground feel like a totally different hue than all the trees back there.
Yeah, you get better with this with lower amounts of colors too. Like
Yeah, the
even
more
with
you-
this Amiga stuff, it's
Yeah.
you're all it takes sometimes is switching one of the like you've got two colors, and changing whichever color you use as a highlight is enough to make it feel like a totally different shaded thing.
Right.
So it takes practice, but
Yep.
they had enough technology here, enough horsepower to make this game completely gorgeous.
Yep.
It's still pretty awesome to watch though.
Yeah.
In action.
Yep. So let's just keep going to the other environments. Oh yeah, here's one that I definitely had a point to make. So we go into, you can see they had a lot of tiles to work with. They transition into these big, on the fly palette fade. That was nice. But like, so you see this here. And when you're making tiles that need to be repeated over a large area, and this happens a
Hmm.
lot with like overhead view games where you've got like dirt and then grass and stuff like that, eventually you end up learning that it's perfectly fine to reuse a tile a lot so long as there's no super specific obvious detail in that particular tile. The more distinct any detail in that tile gets, that makes the repetition really obvious and start to look bad, especially if it's supposed to be a very organic, almost random pattern of like these big
Right.
roots
Yeah.
or branches knotting together. So you can see down here, this is very repetitive. It's just as repetitive, but it's not as obvious and bad look. Like its repetition is not as bad looking because it's a subtle curve and it's just a vine snaking across the ground.
Yep.
That works. Up here, you have a super specific, very distinct intersection where all the vines or whatever, the branches, are all coming together with these really sharp angle changes and really sharp contrast. So it's such a specific design that
Yep.
it makes it really obvious that it's repeating. And all they had to do was reserve a handful of tiles for this one section here to occasionally break it up so that you had that knot and then you had a version where the knots went under where they go over here, or it just dips down more, or there's a completely broken branch, something else. I wouldn't recommend the completely broken branch because that's another super distinctive
Right.
detail and that would
Yeah.
get repetitive too.
I think that one branch that's so brightly lit in the front that has
Yeah.
that clear angle, like if that was just tilted a different way,
And more
or
subtle.
I don't know,
Yeah.
something. Yeah, they could have.
Right.
They could have found a way to do it.
But,
Like they
yeah.
did it perfectly well in that other swamp environment that
Yeah.
had the smaller version of the same sort of
Right.
effect.
Right.
You know, you couldn't really notice as much that it was
Right.
repeating, not only because it was smaller, but they just made it feel more natural.
Right.
This is like, yeah, like this is
So
super
keep that in mind. Really strong shading, something really interesting or complicated, and then really sharp angle changes. You've got a sharp angle change here, and it nearly creases here. And then you've got this really strong drop shadow. So all these things, keep that in mind. If you only have so many tiles to go around to fit in your game, and you're worried about it looking repetitive, don't try to show off and be fancy with cool design work in one of those tiles, because the
Right.
cooler it
Yeah.
is and the more distinct its design is, the more incredibly blatant it is. It's going to be stamped all the way across the screen.
Yeah, you could take, like, if this is, and I'm sure it is actually, if this is technically made of smaller tiles, but a
Mhm.
large tiled section,
Yep.
you could break up those sections,
Yep.
those parts, and use still minimize the use of
Very
tiles,
few tiles.
but
Yeah.
just enough to give it variety, and it wouldn't look nearly
Right.
as repetitious. Yeah,
And look
and
up
this is
here.
also,
Yeah.
I was going to say, as a side note, this is also very true for texture art in 3D.
Mhm.
You notice this all the time. If you have to be very careful when you have very repetitious textures
Yeah,
over a
exactly.
surface. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to, okay, we already talked about this one. And okay, here's one.
Oh,
The,
yeah.
the nacho cheese whiz lava. Yeah,
Right.
you go ahead and go ahead and discuss the lava and just level in general.
Well, the thing about the lava is, like they do it in the lava creatures and the fire here. So you
Mhm.
want to work in those red tones, at least around the edges of lava,
Mhm.
so that it feels hot. Like if it's just yellow, it doesn't. It just doesn't look realistic. It definitely looks like cheese. It looks, or
Right.
just something. It just looks like a liquid, like a yellow
Right.
liquid. It doesn't.
Right.
You want that heat, and that's also going to be true in the rocks and everything around it. You want
Mhm.
that lighting to sort of hit that stuff. It needs to feel like it's in a hot area. It feels very dry, and well, it
Right.
would be dry, but it feels very what do you want to say? Again, with the
Mhm.
very simple gray tones that are
Mhm.
very flat and just not a lot going on there. Yeah, this you can look at plenty of nice lava, sort of volcano environments in
Mhm.
games that make much better use of color. So
Right.
you want some nice sort of cooler tones.
Yeah.
You can work in the cooler tones into the dark areas, but you've got to bring the heat. It just doesn't feel hot to me. That's
Perfect.
how I feel about it. You know,
Perfect
it's
expression. Bring the heat. So, like, what I'm thinking is, like, just like what you said, it desperately needed in this area. The tile set was drawn specifically
a
for this.
glow.
You
Yes.
needed very strong highlight from the light that this is emitting on this left edge on these sides of the rocks. And a little anecdote: I used to have like painting students back in the day, doing landscape stuff and things like that. And one of my students came to me with this big problem. He's like, I can't possibly add more white into the color, but the highlight just isn't bright enough.
Right.
And I said, okay, bring in the painting. Let me show you what the problem is. So he brought it in, and luckily it was with acrylic, so you could just put washes over it really quickly and easily, and it was already dry and stuff like that. Like a glaze, like a translucent layer of paint to change colors and values and stuff like that. So I explained to him, and it blew his mind. It wasn't that his highlights weren't light enough, because they were already pretty much pure white. It's that the medium tones and the darks in the entire painting were not dark enough.
Exactly.
So if you don't have good medium and dark tones, then there's no such thing as making your highlight light enough, because everything is washed out. So even pure white is, you could cut it out and put a light bulb behind it, and it's still not going to look bright enough on that like ridiculously washed out rest of the painting. So you have to keep that in mind. Like, when you want that intense light to emphasize the heat, and remember, like, it's a video game. It's all visual. We can communicate with sound, obviously, and with rumbling joysticks. But to get across the idea of temperature, you can't. You can't make the screen emit heat. So what you can do is reinforce the things that make someone think of heat. You've got the cool wavy effect that I think they did use, but it's actually a little too subtle, but they did do it. Yep.
Like, it amazes me too that the environment guy thought to put some orange tones in the ground down there and not in the lava.
Yes.
Yes. Like, he's using it, like, so that makes it even more obvious.
Right.
But
he had it in his palette. He just didn't use it.
Without all the sprites to use as reference. Like, if he was working on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's strange decisions. Yeah.
But again, everything is a washed out medium tone except for the Cheese Whiz, which is a bit lighter, but still like very little contrast in it. Magma has very high contrast, like the enemies do, right?
Yes.
So, but the point is, you want to hit really nice bright highlights on the edges of the stone that are directly near the lava. And then to emphasize that, you need darker darks than this washed out gray.
Yeah.
And
it's too it looks like a desert or something. You know, it looks like a desert, and it doesn't look right with that with lava, you know. Like you said, that contrast is really going to sell it, and it's going to make that lava feel even more intense, you know, just from a visual perspective.
Aside from the orange fallen leaves from a tree, the gray muted environment feels like it's a very cool spring day, and it's like reaching dusk or something. It feels the opposite of warm.
It's too calm for this chaotic place that they're in, you know.
And again, like, we have the benefit of Google these days, but there were all kinds of, video rental places with documentaries of volcanoes, and there were libraries with beautiful color photos. If you're going to be drawing something for a game that is inherently very specific and very intense, spend the time to do a little research on it. Just look. You don't even have to use your logical mind. You don't have to analyze things. Just look at photos for a while, and you'll develop a sensibility for how it looks. You don't even have to understand. Like, the whole thing about magma is that it is constantly undergoing very rapid temperature changes. And the reason you get the bright yellows and then the dark reds and then the blacks and grays is it's all the same substance reacting as it comes to the surface. There's always the heat source beneath, and then there's the air cooling it. So as it, the stuff on the surface is always
Mhm.
darkening. First, it gets that really beautiful like red color, and then it goes to like grays and blacks as it cools. But it's always got the hot stuff coming up from the bottom that is cracking it and spreading it apart. And that's why you get these cool effects, like in the enemies and these like meatballs, the meteor balls that are falling. That's how you do it
Right.
right. You make sure, as you get to the edges here where it's not as deep and you don't have the direct heat source as much. You want to
Mhm.
start to darken it and make it that cool red and toward the blacks and grays, and immediately it's going to sell so much better and just look so much cooler as magma.
Yeah, and I was gonna say the stone too. Like the
Mhm.
darkness will, visually help
Mhm.
the lava pop
The
more. But
lightness,
also, I
exactly.
think geologically speaking, I think volcanic rock is generally very
Very
dark.
dark,
It's
absolutely.
you go to a tropical island that's a volcanic, you're gonna
Right.
find that's what all the stone looks like.
Exactly right.
So
Yep. So, okay, more very monotonous. At least this is a little better, and you can see why.
I
Yep.
just noticed something.
Yep. Good. Do
Is
I?
that guy's name really Dewey? It never occurred to me.
That is true. He also reminds me a little bit of that actor that's famous for being like really burnt out. What is his name? That blonde guy. It's not Nick Nolte, is it? Oh, I can't think of
Might maybe, yeah.
something
If
like
that's who
that.
you're
He,
thinking of, yeah, I think
yeah.
it does look a little bit
Well,
like
yeah,
him.
I think Nick Nolte is the guy's name. But anyway, so this environment, even though it's incredibly
Hmm.
drab and there's no dark darks, which is a shame, it still looks way more interesting because the artist is doing the smart thing and breaking it into areas of theme. You've got the diagonal
Yeah, yeah.
stone, and then you've got the opposite direction diagonal marbling, and then you've got the very vertical columns, right? Like it's
Hmm.
breaking it into themed areas that are largely monochromatic and largely one. It's just that the artist didn't do enough to make each thing more distinct in value. And
Hmm.
there was no reason to keep everything so ridiculously washed out in the shadow.
Right, right.
But like this statue is cool and nicely detailed, but it's just not like, and you could tell like this is a different range of grays than this, and
Yep,
it's
yep.
different than this. They had plenty of colors to go around. They could have made them more distinct. Again, look at the Nightmare Busters video, everyone, to see how
Yeah.
stuff like that is really done well. But
Yeah, and
yeah,
I can
good.
enjoy all the rendering of it, but yeah,
Yeah,
they just really it's so washed out. It
yeah,
feels like, yeah, you want that shadow back there. If it's going to be solid like that, it
yeah,
needs to be dark enough where it clearly
yeah,
looks like it's that's a shadow hiding
right,
potentially other things back there
yeah,
or whatever, or going back into a dark
yeah.
distance or anything.
It just
But
looks like
with
a
that
yeah.
washed out color, it feels, you know,
It looks like a faded out photograph. It doesn't look
yeah,
like
yeah.
anything remotely in the natural world. It doesn't look like lighting and shading. There's no like foggy atmosphere that can excuse that.
Hmm.
It's yeah, just not well executed. But anyway, let's go to another environment. Well, we have a lot more contrast here, but now we're getting really back into the confetti syndrome. There's so many different architectural and color schemes going on and perspectives. This is really bad. If you're going if you're going to use a very isometric perspective on the floor tiles,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can't go with a very distinctly different vanishing point so close to it. It
Right.
really makes it feel like this
The
is a slope, this is a ramp that they're
if
on.
you if you're ever gonna do this and you do need two different perspective angles,
Right.
you want to make it feel like a curve, so it kind of
Yeah.
looks like
A
what would you call
graceful.
it? Like a yeah, yeah. You,
Yeah.
you otherwise, yeah, that those two lines come in together
Oh
at
god.
completely different. Yeah, it just feels
This is
it just
terrible.
hurts your brain. Yeah,
So the other trick is you rely for your perspective on the horizontal lines getting closer and closer together, like they were smart enough to do back there. The
Hmm.
problem is they didn't de emphasize the diagonal lines, which they should do as you get higher up. Instead of de emphasizing it, they overemphasized it, which makes the perspective look all the more broken. So
Yep.
what
Yep.
they should have been doing is fading out that diagonal line so that by the time you get here, it's non-existent or virtually non-existent, and it's just the occasional few pixels of cracks going
Yeah.
so that you don't see the massive perspective problems. And the same thing here. If they had designed a ground that is more organic, where you don't have these very specific isometric perspective lines, then you won't have this giant clash going between the fake perspective here and the
Yeah.
like ridiculously isometric perspective here.
Yeah, and considering like with that whole angle of that wall and how
Mm-hmm.
big that art is and
Mm-hmm.
unique,
Yep.
it really it all even all every bit of this it suffers from like brickitis. Like it's
Yeah.
all just very like it could have looked so much cooler,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
design wise, but it's like everything's bricks. Yeah, there's a bunch of different kinds, but
Right.
you know,
And
we don't
yeah.
want anything to look too cool, you know.
Right. And again, like brickitis is the perfect term. That's my new favorite term, Corey. Great job. Like everything, I'm a brick. I'm a brick. They did a lot better with this
Right.
column, but you have a column now. You have this great chance to introduce a vertical texture like they did in the
Hmm.
other level. But you're just going, oh, I'm more stacked bricks.
Right.
And again, the doorways. I'm a brick too. Uh, yeah, this game has a severe case of brickitis. Uh, but like here you go, the exact opposite of my advice from last time. It's nothing but the diagonal lines, but at
Yeah.
least there's not an other perspective fighting with it, so it's way
True.
less
Yep.
bad. It
Yeah.
works way better here because there half the screen isn't saying no, 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 no. The perspective is this way, and you end up with an MC Escher
Right.
game. Tiny barrel, like again, like these crates look a lot better over here because they're further in the distance, and then you've got the same crates here, and now they look like comically small.
Yeah. Yeah.
The same thing with the barrel; it looks a lot better up there. But anyway, we'll just keep going through these environments. We don't want to
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
forever.
There's quite a lot in this game actually.
Yeah,
Even though it's well like about a 30-minute game, they
a lot of
travel through a
content.
lot of places. Yeah,
That's for sure.
very fat, very
Yeah.
quickly. I would say.
Again, severe brickitis. I appreciate the fact that they were trying to separate it into large themed areas,
Hmm.
but too repetitive, too specifically separated. Not a lot of good use of strong color and shadow to really pop different areas. Um,
Yeah,
so
well, it's
yeah,
that pillow shading sort of thing going on again.
yeah,
It just
yep. So this environment is one of the better ones. Not only is it a cool concept, but because everything is inherently running out of bandwidth for the video apparently. Let's see if we could get this to load. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Okay. So inherently, the low contrast thing works well. The fact that it's all monochromatic back there helps the dragons pop out.
hmm
The way the texture is a nice combination of verticality and horizontal segments. Like that's all pretty nicely done. They could have blued out and washed out the back layer a little bit more, and it would look even nicer, but not bad.
Right.
Um,
Even if not blue, if it was
yeah.
like misty or
Yeah,
something, it kind
exactly.
of it would
Yeah.
have helped somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. But a cool concept. Oh, this reminds me of another thing we were going to talk about. So remind me to come back here to 1445 after we're
Right.
done just quickly going through the environments.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So again, this works better as far as the perspective because it's all cohesive. You don't have fighting perspectives.
Right.
But again, you have got a severe case of not good use of light and shadow. The
Yeah.
separation of planes, you've got a stair step, perfect chance to really make one plane very clearly highlighted, one plane very clearly in shadow, and so on and so forth. And it just flattens it all out, and it's relying way too many on dark, pillow shady style outlines instead of nice, clean separation of the planes
Hmm.
with strong shadow, and then super severe pillow shading, thick outlines in the back bricks. That was a mistake.
Yeah.
And then again, like they've got this cool ornamental work on this top of the
I know,
column.
and you almost don't notice it. It's
Yeah,
just
exactly.
because it
Low
just blends
contrast,
in. Yeah, it's
and like everything's surrounded with so much brickitis that you're kind of okay. I've got tons of pixels all over the screen saying I'm important when I'm not, and it's all the same like brick. Like that column should have just been nice ribbed vertical column, and it would have just
Hmm.
looked so nice. It would have broken up the monotony. They had plenty of color indices to go where they could have separated, make the high-lit top surfaces of the stair steps more warm, and make the sides of it more neutral, and the really dark more blue, and get like two different tones of stone, one for the
Hmm.
back brick wall, one for the foreground stuff. It could look amazing using the same color indices, the same level of detail, the same amount of time to do the art.
And this is that strange background
Yeah,
a
is it a
thing.
little
I
later?
don't know what they were going for. It looks like it's supposed to be a curve, but it's just so perfectly flat on top, like it loses any sort of perspective or depth
Yeah,
that they were going for.
again with the vertical problem and these diagonal lines, and then suddenly you've got this tiny pattern. Like they didn't know what to do, and they didn't know how to create more depth. So at the last 8 by 8 tile row, they were like, we got to do something to make it smaller, and it makes it look like a roof. It makes it look like they're fighting on a slanted roof. And then there's this weird like big chasm behind and this round wall. Like the
Yeah,
architecture doesn't make sense.
I
And
don't.
yeah, and it really like just get rid of those. And look how thick these diagonal isometric lines are. And just start tapering those out and make it go darker and darker so it fades into that background. And it
Right.
could have looked so much nicer, and there could have been such a nice sense of depth. Okay, let's just quickly get through. We already looked at this environment,
Hmm.
so that one's good. Okay, here we go with another one. Another cool concept, kind of sliding down this mountainside.
Yeah, nicely.
Yeah,
Cool idea.
yeah. Too much texture now, and all
Yeah.
it's mostly medium tone, but it's just it like if they just left more areas of solid color and value, it could have looked much nicer, less distracting. And then you have these like these alligator creatures are so cool and so well
Hmm.
designed, but then they're completely washed out, and you can't appreciate their design and their detail to a large degree. It's a shame, like especially when they overlap each other.
Yeah, I think they're one of the coolest looking regular enemies in
Yeah,
the game, that they appear throughout. And
yep,
yeah, it's so sad because
uh,
they
yep,
look at the detail in there.
yeah. They're beautiful.
That was a labor of love
The
by this
armors,
person. Yeah.
the armor is really cool. Look at that little skull, and then the
Hmm.
plated mail, and like these are cool designs. A 30-second palette tweak, and
Yep.
they'd look like 5 times cooler, and you'd be able to appreciate them on screen. It's a shame.
But that
Instead,
floor,
yeah,
like the floor or
yeah,
or mountainside, it's
yeah,
got higher contrast than they do. So
yeah.
it feels, yeah, it just gives an odd effect
Yeah, it's way
visually.
too distracting. Overall, now this whole thing just looks like a mountain slide, what do you call it? An avalanche of rubble, and they look like
Right.
gold pebbles, and the rest
Right.
of it is like gray stone. That background is very nice. It's one of the most successful in making a
Hmm.
really nice illustrative, muted out back playfield. That's very very nice. It's just the front lacks. It needs darker darks in key places, but way less little details all over the place. More
Yeah.
clean areas of like have some cool stones sticking up and patches of different things. But
Yeah, just the overall texture feels too fine. Like
yeah,
like
exactly.
all
There.
it's like it just needs to be blown up. Like, with there you go. Nice,
But
great.
that's a really nice crevasse. They actually built it
Hmm.
into the gameplay. It looks like Rastan is falling to his death. I guess you had to jump there.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah,
Yep. You fall to your
strange.
death if you don't jump that. But did you see how nice that did at breaking it up and making it more
Hmm.
interesting? Just having that dark shadowed area. They should have had stuff.
A few more,
Yeah,
yeah, a few more things.
break
Even
it
down there
up.
on the left side where it's like there's really nothing going on. Like,
Exactly.
have some things going by over there,
Yeah.
that make it feel.
Poor Rastan is not having good luck with those little chasms there. Um,
Don't you mean Nastar, or is it
yes, in the American release only. Yeah, I really got the feeling that they just didn't want to associate by then the game they knew was subpar with the Rastan franchise.
Right.
So I think that I have a feeling that's why in America. Here's an interesting example of getting your mileage out of stuff. Like, look, this is all human skeletal remains.
Yeah, yeah.
And the contrast is so low, there's so much of it, and they're so small that you don't even notice. You
I
know what I
know
mean?
because it goes by so quick, and it's like this is a fast game. Like when you
Yeah,
watch it, you're like, "Holy crap!" They're like
yeah,
these characters are busting it through this world somehow,
right.
and yeah, like look at like that guy really took the time to put
Yeah.
all those bones
That's
in
a
there, and
lot of
it's
work.
so lost. Yeah.
Like, that's the thing. More is not always better. If there's
Hmm.
something cool, like we talked about this in the Nightmare Busters video, you can get carried away and put quote unquote cool detail in things. But if you put a bunch of cool detail everywhere, then
Hmm.
instead of making the game look better, you've now created massive, like, over, what's the word? You're oversaturating. You're blowing out the ability for the player to appreciate it because it's
Yep.
everywhere all the time. It's like imagine your five most favorite bands, five most favorite songs, right?
Right.
And they're all awesome. And now listen to them all at once at the same volume.
Right. Right.
And now you can't appreciate any of them. It's a cacophony of things that all on their own would be good. You
Didn't
need to
Data
let
do that once in Star
probably
Trek? Like he was like
right.
listening to like three symphonies at once or
Yeah, like
something.
he could do
Because he's
that. He's
able
got
to.
a
Yeah, yeah.
positronic brain in quotes. But so point is, let it breathe. Leave you can't
Yes,
have
sprinkle.
crescendo without calmness.
Right. Sprinkle these bones around in key spots to make them
Right.
interesting and you notice them,
Right. And
but they don't
then
have to be like covering the whole surface of the ground, you know,
right.
it's
And
just
then
enough.
exactly. And then make them the proper scale and give them appropriate contrast. Don't just make it oh, it's a bunch of sort of diagonal. Oh, I get like if you pause it. Oh, I guess that's human remains and a ton of it. It's
Yep.
just
Yeah, again, even if you only had one available index,
yeah,
just hitting the highlight of the bones with a
a more
different
ivory
tone.
color.
That's a
Exactly.
little more bone like. It would be just enough to make it stand out amongst all that other same value that's on the
Yep.
ground, you know. So,
Yeah. This is also a big mistake that the artist did in another environment too. Don't make a rocky ridge that separates the foreground from the background look exactly the same as tiny mountains. Like make them boulders that are like lying there. Make them how do you say striated or like layered, like a cliff edge.
yeah,
Don't
yeah.
make it look like someone drew mountains in the background, but with the same contrast and colors as the foreground. It's
Yeah,
just
if
not a
they
good
it
design
wouldn't take
decision.
much to alter the shapes,
Yeah,
just make them
exactly.
more vertical or whatever, just to make it not seem like yeah, they're like they're almost the same scale as those mountains back. It's
Yeah.
just too close. It's
It looks
too
like a
yeah.
mistake instead of adding interesting stuff. And the other thing is like make them more blocky, make plant them in the ground, really
Right.
delineate where they're on the ground and cast some shadow. Give them a very specific presence that lets them do their job better and makes them more interest. And again, especially when everything's gray, you've now got contrast of value and contrast of like texture, so to speak, right?
Hmm.
Don't render foreground separating boulders the same way and don't make them the same kind of shapes as the background mountains, even though at least thank goodness the background mountains are more blued out.
Right, yeah.
Like if they weren't, it would be really awful and flat. But anyway, yeah, getting if you're going to spend a bunch of work doing stuff, give it mileage. Which part of it is don't put it everywhere, let it breathe, and the places you do leave it really make it count and make it cool.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
like ironically, the whole point was there's dead body remains everywhere. That should be really dramatic,
Right.
but they overdid it so much with no emphasis anywhere that you don't even notice. Whereas if
Yeah,
there were like
just
half as many, but they were emphasized, it would be way more impactful. Like imagine if occasionally you had leaning up against this tree like a very distinct skeleton of a fallen warrior with the armor kind of falling off of him because it's too big, and like his bony hand is still clutching a spear that's right through his midsection, pinning him to the tree.
yeah. I mean, and if you want to go all out,
Yeah,
kind of horror with it, it's like, well, that okay. Instead of your mini mountains back there,
right.
like make that just like actual
Piles
full
of
body
bodies.
skeletons.
Right,
Yeah, yeah, you, like do that. They just have these like quaint little piles of skulls
right,
and then all those scattered bones. It's like there's so much you can do with skeletons and
right,
like remains and stuff that are way more creative,
right. Yeah, exactly.
Not
What?
nicely rendered, but just not,
Yeah,
none of it screams. The only thing that really stands out to me in this environment is that tree, which I think is
yeah,
nicely done.
yeah. It is definitely
But it takes too much of the focus away from these like clearly like they want you to notice this
right,
these bones and everything. So
right. Absolutely. All right, so let's go on to the. I guess it's worth pointing out they bothered making some still screen little cinematics
hmm hmm
um, to sort of carry a narrative that I never paid attention to, but it's very nice that they put in the extra effort. Again, like some of this anatomy is pretty darn good. The proportions are
Yeah, they're
decent.
decently done. It
Yeah,
matches the
in
game.
game,
It
yeah.
feels like yeah, cohesive and everything. Yeah.
Oh, so drab. There was no need. Like let this water be a nice, awesome, murky turquoise or something, and let that
Yeah.
raft be a wood color, even if it's a grade wood color, and give it some contrast, some dark shadows. This could have looked amazing. Conceptually, it's
Yep.
great. It just there was no need to go this gray. That this is probably to me, from on a personal level, the biggest dropped opportunity to have a gorgeous environment that looks really dark and
hmm
foreboding and swampy and stuff. Um,
Agreed. Yeah, it's yeah, cool ideas, but it just needed that extra punch of color, you
and
know.
amazingly, like 99% of our critiques in this game is palette.
Yeah,
Here,
it's
oh, the
that's the
biggest,
sad Oh yeah, this one is
so
like you.
embarrassingly 8-bit. Oh my
Mm-hmm.
goodness. And then, like, you can't do that. You can't put the character supposedly in the background, supposedly in this shadowed area, and he's screaming in saturation and contrast. That makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah, they actually bothered to make this look like it's a darker room, like because
Yeah.
it lights up in a minute, but it's like so they darken that wall there. They have that black, you know what I mean, but not in the cell. It's like
Yeah.
it's gonna be dark. Like clearly they drew it as though it was supposed to be dark in there as well. So it
Yeah.
just didn't. Yeah,
Yeah.
it
Like,
didn't come together.
very strange. Very, very strange. Definitely, this is the worst environment in the whole game on so many levels.
Yeah, yeah.
It relies almost entirely on outlines. It is all completely washed out, not only in color, but in shading for no reason. The torch is so not well drawn and so practically not animated that it
I
almost
mean,
might as well be not animated.
they're only in it for like 2 seconds, but it
Yeah,
just yeah, as they go through the castle again, that's another thing with Nightmare Busters. They did a
yeah,
castle that was like amazingly interesting,
yeah,
considering what it was. But this is exactly what you would think of as you know
yeah.
nothing in particular that sticks out as imaginative or anything.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, that looks so weird. Oh, it's a stack of them. That was a mistake. Like I literally couldn't tell what
oh
that was
okay,
supposed to
yeah.
be.
hmm
Like it's one thing to have a concept, but if it just looks bad or confusing or like a graphical glitch, rethink what you're doing.
hmm
You know what I mean? Like they needed to address that a different way, or make it a blade that literally rises up, because that's the effect of it in gameplay. Like put a slit in the floor and make a blade come up in steps out of the floor and get higher and higher, or something that would
yeah,
have the
yeah.
same gameplay effect, and you'd be able to tell what the heck is going on.
hmm
All right, so that's it for that environment. Let's
And
just,
they just decided we're putting every enemy in there. But
yeah. Yeah, I want to
this is
touch a
kind of
lot.
neat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a shame. They actually did what's called line scrolling there, which is great, but they did it so subtly you almost can't tell. And again, it makes it very vertical. The water back here should have been scrolling way slower compared to the water up here. Like,
Hmm.
can you even tell on the screen share that they did do line slicing? Like they slice it up so like this is scrolling slower than this, and this is
Yeah. Yeah.
you almost
Uh,
can't tell. They didn't do it anywhere near enough. It's a shame. Like you bother
it's
programming it and
yeah. It give it the
the depth, the
because the
distance,
wall back there feels so back
far
there.
away.
Like it feels so
Exactly.
distant, and yeah, that would have helped a lot.
Yeah. More just everything's gray. They've got three different kinds of gray,
Oh, I know.
but and
A
everything's
bluish
medium
gray, a
tone.
greenish gray, and a
Bluish gray, yeah, and then
yep.
the neutral, pretty neutral or slightly brownish gray. Here's another example. They almost did this well. They had the right idea.
Hmm.
Large segmented areas of a color screen that on its own, or a color scheme that's on its own, fairly monochromatic, and then they even had the foresight to break up the monotonous foreground with some nice strong dark shadows, but they didn't darken them enough. They blued it, which was fantastic, but
Right.
you could still see the details too strongly in it, and the lights in it and the mediums didn't get dark enough. That would have looked so good.
Oh yeah,
And then
yeah.
like the way they rim lit, they actually they're using flipped tiles, and that was perfect because it creates a more rim lit effect on this with the dark center. That's really beautiful.
And I'm
Again,
also sad
yeah,
too to see that pillar not actually go into the ground.
yeah,
Like, you
yeah,
know what I mean?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
just like you got the plane going across, and
yeah,
it feels disconnected too much.
yeah,
But still, like this is much closer
yeah,
to like getting in that realm of, hey, look what you could have done.
yeah,
You had the hardware, you had the colors,
yeah.
you know.
And again, like Rastan himself, especially this lady Sophia, they could break their ankle in this floor.
Right,
You
yeah.
know, like why is the delineation between each stone so gargantuan?
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
that old guy's got no, he's gonna trip and
yeah,
break a
he's gonna
hip, you
break a
know.
hip. There's no
Yeah.
way. I hope he has his medic alert badge or
Right.
bracelet. Um, this level, more than any others, I think, a quick palette tweak to the whole level, it could have looked very nice and like Neo Geo quality. That
Oh
and
yeah.
getting the making the delineation between each stone in the floor less thick, and like you said, that would have been the cherry on top to actually bring this this
Hmm.
column into the foreground. This had so much potential. The artists were good. They needed a color and lighting guy. Like if one of the artists had like more training and sensibility to that sort of stuff, this game would have looked easily 10 times better in the blink of an eye. See, here you go. Nice, again, nice separation. It's backlit. The lights in here are too light. That looks a little gross. But the right idea, like breaking it up into, oh,
Hmm.
that's going to cast a shadow and that's going to help break up the
It's close.
floor.
Yeah, this is very close to okay, now you've got some atmosphere. You've
Yeah,
got lighting hit
yeah,
from it looks it's clear and the nice ocean breaking up
yeah.
those spots. It's very close.
So
Yeah.
close. This could look amazing. Again, palette tweaks. Fix the contrast of that alligator guy that was there. He's not
Hmm.
there now. And then don't make the lights in here so light because that just looks like barnacles instead of a backlit
Yeah, that's
architecture.
strange. Yeah, yeah, it
And
gives a
then
weird.
way too thick
Oh,
outlines. And then when something is in shadow, you don't see the specific details as well. Tone
nope.
those lights down. Let it be a nice dark shadow. Would look amazing. That I really like that environment. And here we have the final boss. They did the perspective way better to go into the distance. It
Hmm.
should have gotten darker still and picked up more of the red tone of the sky as it went back. That would have been
Yeah, they do
perfect.
a weird effect here where it's like the whole place is like doing weird color change. Yeah, see,
Yeah,
it does this weird.
yeah,
I don't know if that works or not, but My feeling about this environment is it's just so simple. It's like this is the
Yeah,
last boss. You
yeah,
could have, you know, like it's a floor.
yeah.
It's there you go.
And again, it's like missed opportunities. They had very few tiles they used for the entire environment. They could have made it more interesting.
Hmm.
That boss character looks awesome. Very well drawn, very well designed, great anatomy, good shading. He hardly does anything but hop up and down.
Right.
They're not using all the sprite power of the system for any other enemies. There could have been,
No, there's nothing else going on here.
so
Yeah,
they could have made him bigger, or he could have been throwing out like really cool fireballs or something.
I
Uh,
think maybe they ran out of time with this guy and they just
Maybe
kind
it's
of
a
had to
shame.
get him done.
Yeah.
Sky Guy in this, the Sky artist did his job here, and he was like, "Yeah, man, that's an awesome sky. I got that." And then everybody else was like, "Oh, I don't have time."
Yeah, you've got to save. You've got to make sure. You should be working toward the middle of development of the game. You should start working on your final boss fight because it
Mm.
needs to be epic. You can't let the game
Yeah,
end
that
and
feels.
kind
They
of a
just kind of
wah
get him over to
wah.
the side. Yeah, like,
Yeah,
mm,
and that's a
feels
shame.
underwhelming.
Yeah, exactly. But I've never seen that before. No, I'm kidding. But I'm perfectly fine with tropes like that. It works. But
Right.
and it's falling into the water instead of into the ground like every Castlevania game. But anyway, so that's it for going through all the environments. But there is some important stuff that we need to wrap up with. So before we cover the last couple of points, we wanted to bring up, Corey had noticed something that's a great point. This is the first ever text confetti syndrome I've ever seen, and they didn't give the font. There's perfectly fine horizontal spacing, although this
Hmm.
isn't the most readable font to begin with. They didn't give it any vertical spacing at all, which just sort of visually clumps it all together and makes it so much less appealing and so much harder to read visually.
Yeah,
So
it speaks to the design of that font too. Like
yeah,
it's a lot of lines going different directions, and it feel like yeah,
yeah.
reading that is not fun.
Not
It's
pleasant,
just
and then
yeah,
like literally there's no space between each row of text, and then there's no space between the text and the image, and it would look so
yep.
much nicer. Again, this is that same point. Give things room to breathe so you can appreciate them. Don't
Hmm.
make things like kind of instead of contrast each other in a nice way. Don't make things fight each other and make it look worse. Um, and anyway, so there's that. So now one of the last really important ideas we wanted to talk about is going back to the characters, and this is from the sort of animation and visual end. And this is a
Right.
great point that Corey had. Is I think it was there was something during the horse level. Oh yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
if you watch Rastan with his sword, like he's holding it like straight up, and this
yeah,
is common throughout the game. Like you said, they're trying to save sprite
yeah,
space or something like
yeah,
that. But when he's riding, he's holding it up a lot of the time, and it
straight
just
up,
looks
yeah,
awkward being at such a perfect angle.
yeah, yeah. And there was,
Unnatural.
yeah, there was. I think the Crocodile Men too have the same issue, which is much earlier on. If
Yeah,
we'll be able to
I'm trying
find that,
to
scan
see.
around.
I
Oh
think it's about
yeah,
19 minutes or so. They've got that
yeah.
same issue. Like there's a
Th-
bunch of them.
this guy
Yeah,
too.
see?
This night. I mean, it's an understandable instinct if you're not used to working in low res, which I mean, back then that was perfectly high res. That was way higher res than most games because it was two screens side by side and they're very big characters. But
Hmm.
it can be scary to have to deal with the kind of jaggy effect to put a weapon, especially a long, thin weapon, on an angle. But
Yep.
you can do it, and it looks great once everything's in action when you're moving it around.
Well, when you
But
have characters that are
yeah,
this high quality, like they've got lots of great animation and
yeah,
poses for these characters and anatomy going on. Like,
yeah.
yeah, like just tilting those swords just a hair is
Yeah,
enough. It's gonna
and
feel much nicer.
and then if you have to, if you really have to, if you can't get past the jaggedness of going on an angle, part of it is because you have an extremely bland, perfectly straight sword design.
Yep.
Like that sword could have been designed much more like a scimitar with a more organic style hilt and stuff like that, or could have had interesting angles to it, and then there would be way less of that worry that you're not getting a really clean delineation of a blade unless you have it straight side by side or straight up and down. But yeah, at that resolution with the number of colors they have to go with, they shouldn't have worried about it, and they just should have put it at nice, sensible, organic-looking angles.
Yeah.
But that does tie into the other thing that is related. So you have the stiffness of the individual poses with the weapons, and then you also have the stiffness of the animation. And we noticed in this game, never anywhere in this game is there any motion blur, which is there's a real shame. And by that, I don't mean like some kind of fancy high tech, what do they call that? Like hardware accelerated graphic.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, literally just hand drawing a blurred blade, in a nice arc to emphasize the movement of the blade. It not only looks better and more natural, but the funny thing is, when you've got big characters like this, and they've got to do a big swing, that's a lot of new art. You can actually do it quicker and spend less memory and have a way better looking attack that looks more impactful if you only have a couple of frames for the what's called the tell, or the anticipation, where the character is reeling back like they're going to swing, like they're putting the sword back. And then you just have your follow-through frame, like you instantaneously go to the first of your follow-through frames where the sword is now at the other extreme, has already been swung, and you just have like a 1 or 2 frame really big motion blur that you put there, and then you quickly fade out while the character continues to follow through. So what they do in this game, and I can actually set the playback speed super slow.
Yep.
And if I play it, when we'll see when Rastan swings, there's no motion blur, and it really looks like the artist spent the same duration for every frame of the attack. You can control in any game engine how much time any given frame has on it. So what you should do is linger longer on the anticipation and the follow-through frames, and then have that attack happen very quickly with a motion blur that fades out quickly. And that's going to give it more snap, more impact. It's going to look way cooler with the motion blur and look way smoother. And it's going to take less work and less memory. So it's like a win-win-win.
Yeah, it's almost like the artist was thinking in terms of like traditional animation, where there's going to be a set exact frame rate no matter what. Exactly. And that's, obviously you can
you
get
don't
around
have to
that
do
with
that.
games. Yeah.
Right.
So.
And the other thing is, when they did that for cartoons, you had 24 frames per second. They had probably 4 frames per second for, like because of the size of the characters, how many characters on screen, the memory limitations. You don't have that luxury to make it smooth. And even in cartoons, they would build motion blur into the frames, like the same way you should do it as a sprite artist.
I mean, I appreciate all those poses, but it looks like each one is done individually, and that sword doesn't blur. So it just it like when he's doing those fast swings, it's so like you see that sword just kind of sticking all over the place instead of pop. Doing a clear motion. So that's the issue.
So that's the thing. Animation is not imagining the exact pose of every split second in a movement. It's understanding and creating the illusion and emphasizing and exaggerating the movement itself. So, like, it's really important to study animation and cartooning and see how much they would intentionally smear and warp and stretch. Like, even if it's just someone throwing a punch or someone waving their arm, they're going to completely stretch out and warp those fingers and stuff like that to all emphasize that sort of trail of motion. And the more you can, the more you learn about that and can do it, the better and more convincing and more cool the motion is going to be. And you can always find that balance. You don't want to get hyper cartoony like the original and really fun Battletoad games where someone's foot or fist gets like 20 times too big. But when you understand those methods, you can always find that balance of doing it enough that it matches the style of the game and it just makes everything cooler. But in any rate, even if you were recording someone swinging a sword at 24 frames per second, every frame during that fast motion would have natural blurring and smearing in it. It wouldn't be a crystal clear frame.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
really clear example of that is like lightsabers, like how they did the
Yeah.
effects. Like
Yeah.
in like you can tell that they did the effect over where the stick was blurring that they were
Right.
using, and it's very, very obvious. Like
Right.
so you see that blur as they move. That's the kind of thing you want. Maybe not that
Yeah, but
heavy,
that's a great example
but
because it's the
yeah.
ultimate exaggeration and it works
Hmm.
so well. It emphasizes the motion where it was, where it is now. It perfectly emphasizes the motion, but it also emphasizes that this is a thing emitting immense light and it's leaving
Right,
a
right.
trail of light, basically burning the light into your retina. You know what I mean? So
Right.
fast that it takes a while to fade out. So it's, yeah, a very well done. So that was it for just in general. You have that big risk when you're drawing and animating large characters. The space between the movement of each limb is inherently going to be more pixels, so the movement is going to look more jumpy, and that you're inherently get these risks for things looking poppy and stiff,
Hmm.
and you need to counteract that as cleverly as you can, if that's a word, with motion
Right, right.
blurs and with making sure your poses, any of the frames, are not stiff. Don't make anyone stand stiff. Don't make anyone hold their swords straight up. Those kind of things
Yeah,
really
unless
go
it's
a
like
long
a
way.
robot
Right,
that would do something like that. It's a person though, they're
right.
never gonna have that perfect 90
Right,
degree
that's a great
peak,
example. It's you
Yeah.
know the rules, so you know when to break it on purpose to emphasize the stiff robotic nature of a robot character, right?
Hmm.
But you have to have those concepts in mind. You have to know the rules to know when to break them and why.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's it for that. And then the last big point of this game, I think we both agree the biggest sort of point of this game, of this video, is the concept. Oh, we never talked about this guy. Again, an issue of scale. Why is he so huge? Why are his gloves and boots so
He's
comically big? He's so
yeah.
cartoony compared to everyone else. His contrast in his blacks compared to the next darkest color is so blown out. He
Hmm.
doesn't fit in the game. It's like he was maybe one of the first concept sprites made ever to pitch the game, and then they just kind
Yeah.
of left him in.
And like they're trying to sell you like an overweight skeleton, which is
Yeah, yeah. That
like
belt
what
would never
does he have
stay.
pillows in there or
Yeah,
like what's going on?
yeah. It's just he's too cartoony.
Yeah.
But anyway, to get back to the big point, here you had a game with very good artists. The game design looks very good. They had a lot of cool ideas. They made a big mistake, which is a conceptual version of Confetti Syndrome. So
Hmm.
here you have the first level of the game. So here we start. You're getting going, playing. You've got these really weird. It's a forest. Okay, you're in a
Right. Yeah.
forest. Where are those enemies? Let's see them. Okay, so you've got these really weird tentacle things. It would be one thing if they were vine things. It's a
Right.
forest. If they
Right.
were like moving plant, Venus flytrap, thorny vine tentacled enemies, that would be awesome. But they're ocean life, uh, octopus, weird
Yeah,
tentacle
they almost have a
things.
horror vibe to them as well.
Yeah,
Like they feel,
Cthulhu, yeah.
yeah, very out of place.
Yeah,
Just
that's the key. Out of place.
yeah.
So you've got a forest themed environment. The first enemies you see are out of nowhere. They belong in an ocean
Not
or a
what you
swamp
expected,
level,
right?
right? So, but no, wait now. You've got big fat undead guy with giant boots and gloves. All right, these are the first two enemies you see in the first few seconds. That neither really has anything to do with the forest, and neither has anything to do with each other in any way.
Right.
But it gets worse. This is the first two enemies you see in the first level. All right. So who are we? Who are we gonna? Oh, that's right. I forgot. I have the gameplay set, the playback speed.
Oh
That
yeah.
is not helping us in this moment.
There
Okay,
we
more
go.
of the tentacle guy. All right, who's next? Okay, fishmen. Fishmen are sort of related to the tentacle guys, but not really. It is because of ocean, but that's not related to this environment.
Yeah, there's no water around. You know, if there was a lake
Right.
back there or something,
I think there
fine,
will be
you know, but
later, maybe in the background, but the point is that's the background, and you're in a forest, and the whole point is you've got all this creative stuff. Don't hit the people with everything all at once, because again, it's just like putting cool details or listening to your five favorite songs all at once. Let it breathe. Let each thing have its theme, and then you get
mhm.
to appreciate everything for how it works in the theme. It's just like a great song. The drums and the bass and the instruments and then the vocals that come in, it all was carefully constructed to work together beautifully.
Yeah, you
What,
don't want
yeah,
the guy doing his drum solo at the same time
as a
the
guitar
guy's doing his
solo.
guitar solo. You know, it's like these things
Right,
all the entire flow of the song, it's crafted to all mean something and give a
right,
certain feeling. When your game has that randomness, like they
right.
clearly, my thought on this is they had a list, like they made a list of like
Yep,
we need these kinds of enemies,
yep,
and they just had no thought into where they were going to put them or
yeah,
anything, and they just kind of sprinkled them. You know,
yeah.
the bosses are a bit
Exactly.
mean, you
It's
know, but
it's Christmas list syndrome, not
yeah,
in
because then
gameplay and
there's
visuals.
crocodile guys, you
It's
know, like
like you could tell it was like we're going to get up a big skilled team. We're going to have a nice budget for the game. We really want to beat Golden Axe. We've got all these cool ideas. So we're going to write down a big list, like you said, of these cool ideas. Well, what kind of different enemies can we have? And they just had the artists pop these things out down the list, as many as they could
hmm
in the development time. But then the game designer and the level designer was like, oh, we'll sprinkle these here and we'll sprinkle these here. And then you end up in the first couple of levels, you've blown your wad, to use a crude, like everything has been thrown at the player, not only all at once, so you have nothing to surprise them with anymore, but now it's like, what, confetti. It's like, what? There's a tentacles and there's this and there's that. There's no time to appreciate everything for what it is and in a theme. There's no breathing room, and it's just like,
yeah, like this, it's like, okay, it's kind of like a rubble town.
yeah,
Like my thinking is like, oh, maybe you're saving this town or something. Like that's my
right,
thought when I
right.
see this scene. But it's like, okay, the crocodile men are invading. Oh wait, but the undead guys are invading. Oh wait, but the fishmen are also invading. And then
And
there's
then there's
guys
knights
here.
that look like good
Yeah.
guys. They look like paladins. Why?
It's
Like,
it's it's a bit confusing. You're
yeah,
like, are these people like this army is working
yeah,
together? Like they actually have,
yeah.
you know, it's
Keep this
it,
in mind, everybody. Themes and building.
mm-hmm,
When the game starts, nice generic forest, just like Golden Axe. Hit them with a little bit of variety of humanoid enemies.
right.
Maybe at the end, start to get cool and introduce, like, yo, the enemy is an undead guy. That's kind of cool. That could work if you do it right. But just like stick to a theme, and at first don't hit them with anything too crazy, and certainly not a bunch of totally different crazy things all at once, so that at that point it's like, what are you gonna surprise them with? And like they clearly did not have the game level designers, at least the idea of themes was almost completely non-existent until they finally did it right in one spot. Do you have the timestamp
Yeah.
for that handy, or can I? I'll scrub through until, in the meantime, to see if you can find it. I think it's here, but I
I
could be
believe
wrong.
it's
Here it is.
13 minutes or
Yep.
so. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
this is
Excellent.
amazing
So
actually. Yeah.
here you have a castle, and you're high up in the
Mm-hmm.
castle, and then they've got this cool thing where you fall to bring you into the boss fight. And
Right.
I didn't pay a lot of attention to the beginning of this level, but that's less relevant. And then you have these cool wizards that cast spells in German for whatever reason, like actual sampled German voice actors. But so you're going up, and then you fall down. That's all like themes. You've got this castle, you've got this verticality. Look, you're in a castle and you're fighting knights. Look at this. Like the game designer for this level actually was
Right.
thinking about making things cohesive. And yeah, I
Hmm.
think the art kind of dropped the ball in the environment. But look, cool, it falls. You look now.
Yeah, nice idea. Yeah.
You're still in more of the castle. Suddenly, you're introducing magic. The torches are setting the theme. The
Hmm.
torches light up magically. Castle, throne, theme. And now you've introduced the undead guy, and he's just
Right.
sitting there. And like the audio, I'll turn the audio. I don't know if you guys will be able to hear it, but so now you've got an undead guy, and they had a really cool idea. He's an
Oh yeah.
undead knight. He's cursed. He's not happy with his lot in afterlife and death. He literally keeps saying, "Help me." He wants you to destroy him to cast him from his mortal bonds. Uh,
Yeah, and he's just limp there. He's not even hardly animated.
exactly.
It's amazing, even though they didn't have to put much work into it.
Right.
And then yeah, he's got his weird
Undead
skeleton.
minions.
Yeah.
Undead a theme. And again, like
Yep.
you've got these phantoms coming out of him. Everything is themed to curse, to undead, to spirits, to knights, to castle, to
They actually did the
thrones.
shadows
Yes.
better in this
Less
environment too, to
detail.
really make it
Yes.
feel, yeah, it's just
Yes. This this group that did this level was so on the ball, or they had a director for
right.
everything, for the theme and the visuals. This is so much more cinematic. This is so much more. I was going to say they were obviously influenced by Golden Axe, but they obviously also went back to the original thing that inspired Golden Axe in the first place, Conan. This
Right.
feels like a movie.
Hmm.
This it sticks to a theme beautifully. So in so many ways, it is so
And
cool.
it's
This
not
is how you
even
do it. Yeah,
it's not even about the technical achievement or anything.
not at
It's just
all.
it was the right ideas and they put the right things together.
Yep.
You know, it's
From a technical standpoint, this is one of the more underwhelming and mundane. Like, not huge
right.
sprites, not a lot of animation, not fancy effects on the background, but cool ideas presented in a way where it can breathe, where it's all in a theme, where you really get to appreciate it. And look at the lighting effect they added. He just sits there, but just before he spits out those phantoms, look at the light. It's a
Yep.
warning. It's a tell in video game play sense, but it also looks cool, and it's a, that's how you do it. Like everything could have been done even cooler, blah blah blah, if they had more time, if they used more sprites and more memory and stuff like that. But I'll turn the volume back down. Look at how much more mileage. Look at the coolness factor of it, because they didn't just throw everything in the kitchen sink at you all at once. And to me, the two big things in this game, that's it. Learn to spread it out and stick to a theme, and just really let people appreciate a few things at a time, and let
Yep.
it build that way.
Save the crocodile guy. You know,
For the swamp
beautifully done
level,
for the marsh, and
yeah,
let him come out of the water. You know, and it's like surprise you, and then you
right,
like people. You know, they're gonna appreciate it. It makes the impact it deserves. You know, because
exactly.
obviously it was well done art.
Yep,
He didn't deserve to just meander into that first level. You
right.
know, it was
Look at this.
it didn't make you feel like he was special. You know,
Right.
so
So you finally get to this beautiful swamp level, and guess what? You've seen the enemies all before.
right. Yeah.
Like, it's interesting to have kind of like Central South American native style warriors,
Sure. Yeah.
but you don't just have them. Oh, they're in the European castle level. They're in the, like, I know I saw these guys elsewhere in the
Yeah, they
game.
look better here,
Yeah,
but
it makes more
it just
sense.
yeah, they're just everywhere. Yeah, they
Yeah,
go.
but like have one section that looks like a humanoid, like straw hut village, and put them there. And
Yeah,
then in the really swampy area, have the fish guys and the alligator guys, and have the alligator
right.
guys on the patches of land, and have the fish guys in the water, more or less. Just like they did beautifully in this environment, break it into your specific chunks of like very nice water plant in the foreground, very pretty water with the reflections, very cohesive, the briars or whatever that is back there, and then these areas of dry grassy land. Do the same thing, break it up into sections of, oh, we've got these kind of enemies, and they introduce this kind of gameplay. And then you get to that boss. Like, what is a bunch of dragons? Why are they living in a swamp? Like, they're regular looking dragons.
I mean, you could say they're maybe supposed to be snake-like, but they don't really look snake-like. I
Yeah,
mean,
they really dropped the ball then, because they could have had it coming up out of the water, which could have looked cooler, and make them look more eel-like, which would have been more
yeah.
creative, and it would have tied all the themes together. Instead,
Hmm.
it looks like they're out of place regular dragons that are just for some reason stuck in the briars, or they're like
Yeah,
not
like
even.
their
It's like
bodies
they're
are back there, and
severed
it's
severed
just their
heads.
necks they're sticking through. Yeah.
Yeah, but they should be saying "help me" too, because there's like, "Don't attack me, attack the briars, and I'll fly away peacefully once you free me from this tangle." But anyway, those are the two big things. That theme, stick to a theme, let each theme breathe, get the most out of each theme, give that thought, loving care, space it out so that like you get to build on things and introduce the more and more fanciful and crazy and cool and intimidating things as you progress. And then just the palette thing,
Right.
like balancing the overall use of colors, making sure all the characters and important things have the same level of contrast. Just don't make everything a grainy mid-tone gray everywhere, which way too much of the game suffers from, which is a real shame. But again, again, I guess to end on this note, so unless you have any other specific thoughts,
Well, all I
again,
was gonna
yeah, yeah,
say
yeah.
is Dewey is Gary Busey,
Mm.
not Nick Nolte.
Thank
So.
you. That's it. That's exactly right. Yes,
That's
Gary
that's it.
Busey. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Anyways,
Yeah, I
you
knew.
take.
I knew it was exactly someone, but I knew I had the name wrong. Thank you for this game. Looks really fun. We've got to play it at some point. Maybe we'll do
Yeah,
like a
it
let's
looks
play video.
incredibly. It's so fast. Like
Yeah,
like they. I was amazed when I watched it. I was like, man, this is
yeah,
like 30 minutes, 30
yeah,
minute romp. But they go through like 20 places or so. Like
yeah, yeah,
it's fast. It looks fun as hell. Yeah,
yeah.
it's.
Like I think it was a good team of designers, a good team
Mhm.
of artists. They had great ideas. It's just in the sort of directorial kind of aspect that, like, if one other person were there with these things in mind, the game
Mhm.
could be a world renowned masterpiece. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Like the team was very strong. So we're not crapping on the game. Like these were good artists and
No,
good
yeah,
designers,
it's
and clearly, and like I said, most of the time that there's these shortcomings, it's because they didn't have the time and the budget to, like, in hindsight everybody can criticize and say this could have been done better in this way, but these are still very useful things to, like, sort of post-mortem, these
right.
constructive criticisms. The more of this stuff you have in mind while you're developing the game, the more you can avoid these shortcomings and quickly correct them as you're developing the game, which then doesn't need a long polish iterative cycle because you've had these things in mind to begin with.
Yeah, definitely.
And the more of the team that has this in mind, like Corey was saying, the more the game designer can get feedback and say, hey, that's really cool, but I really wish, like, could you tweak that to emphasize this or that thing to really pull this thing
Hmm.
off? Those kind of bouncing back. When the whole team, like, if you have a bunch of artists working, it's great to let all the artists see what the other artists are working on because we're inherently very competitive creatures, artists. And
Oh yeah.
the quality of the game is going to skyrocket when everybody is seeing and wants to one up what everyone's doing. But we also inherently we want our art to all look as good as possible with all the other art. So we start harmonizing the palette use and the contrast use just without even saying anything to each other. It just
Yep.
happens automatically. So don't keep your team in the dark. And the more everybody is giving feedback and seeing what each other is doing, it's going to increase morale and it's going to increase the quality without the need for long iteration or for a specific director to force people to redo things. They're just doing it better as they go.
Definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it speaks to that. So the communication of it all. Like everyone needs to be kind of on the same page, and
Yeah.
clearly some of that went a little wrong with this game, whether
Mm.
it was time or budget or what have you. But even say that being said, clearly a lot of love and effort
Yeah.
and energy and talent
Yep.
and money went into this game. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
I can see it. Like this was no easy feat
Right.
at all, and it's still quite amazing to watch,
Yeah.
to see in action. So I
Yeah.
still have to give them the credit, of
Yeah.
creating something that is incredibly unique that you don't see every day.
Yeah. And it is a shame that this, to my knowledge, didn't just never made it to the States.
I know. I would have
Uh,
loved it. Yeah.
Very fun looking, high quality, creative game. And yeah, I really think it really is. Like, there's a reason we picked it for this hidden treasure theme of videos. We hope this is a new game for a lot of you viewers, and we hope we made some interesting points that will help you if you're working on game projects, or even if you're just a game player. It might give you an added appreciation for the kind of work and mindset and thinking that that developers and artists and art directors have to keep in mind while they're developing a game.
Hmm.
And yeah, that's I think that pretty much wraps it up for this one. Um,
Yeah, I believe so.
yeah, so thanks everyone very much for watching, and stay tuned for more upcoming videos.
If you enjoy our content and want to keep up to date on our games, please leave a like and subscribe. Also, if you want to support our projects, consider becoming a patron. The link's in the description, and we'll see you soon.